The lanterns flicker against the canvas walls, throwing long, trembling shadows across the fever tents. The air smells of sweat, damp wool, and something sharp and chemical, that bitter medicine the surgeons call salvation. Outside, the jungle hums alive, endless, waiting. Every night, the buzzing grows louder, as if the mosquitoes themselves were whispering the Empire's undoing. In the distance, a bugle sounds, then fades into coughing. The fever has taken another. It is the height of the Victorian age, an empire gilded in progress and shadow. Steamships circle the globe, soldiers march under the Union Jack, and somewhere between conquest and collapse, a white powder in a green bottle becomes a miracle. Quinine, born from the bark of South American trees, will march beside every soldier, poured into their rations, stirred into gin, and swallowed with a grimace. It tastes like death itself, but it promises life. They will call it the bitter cure, a medicine that built empires, saved armies, and chained continents. So today, keep the glass steady and listen, because this is how the fever broke and how bitterness became the taste of empire. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It fell in sheets that hissed through the canopy and turned the earth to red clay, streaked with the footprints of men who carried more faith than strength. I had followed them into the mountains of Peru, Jesuit fathers wrapped in soaked wool and silence, their crucifixes glinting faintly whenever lightning tore through the sky. Every few hours, one of them would cough, deep and wet, the kind of sound that carries the weight of fever. By the time we reached the village, one had already begun to shiver. The people there, the Quechua, watched us from behind wooden doors. To them, this was nothing new. They had seen the fever come and go for generations, the chills that took strong men and left them hollow-eyed before the next moon. But tonight, something was different. A woman came forward, her grey braids heavy with rain. She carried a bowl carved from gourd and a pouch of pale bark. Without a word, she knelt beside the trembling priest and began to mix a drink that smelled of damp leaves and bitterness. The Jesuits hesitated. They had seen medicine made from roots and prayers before, and most ended in silence. But this woman's eyes were calm, too calm for the storm that surrounded us. She pressed the wooden bowl into the priest's hands and nodded once. He drank, grimacing, nearly choking on the taste. The others crossed themselves as if he had swallowed blasphemy. Hours passed. The rain eased. By dawn, his fever had broken. No one spoke of miracles. But when the priest stood the next morning and asked for more of the bark, every head turned toward the mountains. The woman told them the tree grew only where the earth was coldest, where the mist never lifted, and the roots clung to stones slick with moss. She called it quina, the bark of barks. Its bitterness, she said, carried power. It cooled the fire inside the blood. It taught death to wait. They followed her to the slope where the trees stood tall, thin things with silver bark that peeled away in curls. The Jesuits cut what they could carry, wrapping the strips in linen, whispering that God had hidden his mercy in the heart of the forest. They prayed over the fallen branches, half out of gratitude, half out of fear. For every miracle in the New World seemed to demand a price. Weeks later, the bark would dry, harden, and grind into a pale powder that traveled across oceans. It would be traded for silver and souls, renamed and resold as Jesuits' powder. But here, in this dripping silence, it was still only a secret, a tree that drank the rain and gave back life. The fever would return, of course, it always did. But from that night on, the soldiers and the missionaries would carry a new kind of faith, not in prayer or penance, but in a taste so bitter it made their eyes water. The taste of survival, the beginning of empire, hidden in the bark of a Peruvian tree. She lived where the clouds touched the soil, a ridge so steep that mules refused to climb it. The villagers called her Mama Isidora, though no one could say if she was a healer or a spirit that refused to die. Her hut was made of stone and smoke, roofed with moss and the bones of trees. The air there always smelled of bark, bitter, dry. almost metallic, as if the mountain itself exhaled through her doorway. When I first saw her, she was sitting by the fire with her hands in a woven basket, sorting strips of quina bark by color: ivory for the strong, cinnamon for the mild, and deep umber for the dying. Every piece seemed to hum with something unseen. Around her, bundles of herbs hung from the beams: coca leaves, mountain mint, crushed orchid roots. But the bark, she said, was the only one that spoke. "People come here when their blood turns to fire," she told me, not looking up. Her voice was hoarse but calm, worn by wind and prayer. "Some ask for healing, others come only to be buried." She did not charge coin, only gratitude. And those who survived left small offerings: silver trinkets, carved stones, a lock of hair, sometimes a child's drawing burned at the edges. The Jesuit fathers had climbed to her door once before, carrying a noblewoman half dead with fever. They had prayed over her in Latin until their throats cracked, but the shivering did not stop. Isidora had listened without expression, then sent them all outside. She crushed the bark with river stones, mixed it with warm water and honey, and held it to the woman's lips. They say her eyes fluttered open at dawn, sweat drying like salt on her skin. By noon, her pulse had steadied. The priests called it divine. Isidora only spat in the dirt. "The mountain gives what it takes," she said. Word of her miracles spread faster than rain down the valleys. Merchants and soldiers began to arrive, not for the woman, but for the tree. They brought knives and sacks, cutting more than they needed, leaving stumps bleeding sap into the mud. Isidora watched them from her doorway, a clay pipe glowing faintly between her fingers. "The fever will follow them," she murmured. "It always follows the greedy." Before the Jesuits left, one of them tried to buy her secret. He laid silver coins on her table. She pushed them aside. "You cannot own bitterness," she told him. "It must be swallowed." But they took the bark anyway, wrapped in cloth, carried on mules, prayed over as they descended toward the coast. Years later, sailors would carry that same bark across the Atlantic, grinding it into powder in the bellies of ships where slaves lay chained beside crates of treasure. The fever would go with them, and so would its cure. But in the high mountains, Mama Isidora sat by her fire, listening to the wind scrape the trees bare. She knew the balance had been broken, and she knew the world below would pay for what it had stolen. The ship that carried the bark was called La Esperanza, the Hope. She was a narrow Spanish frigate with masts that groaned in the wind, and a hull that smelled of salt, citrus, and sickness. In the captain's quarters, among chests of cacao and silver, sat a single crate lined with linen. Inside it lay the powdered remains of the fever tree, wrapped in parchment and prayer. The sailors didn't know its worth. To them it was just another cargo, another superstition from the mountains. But in Lima, the rumor of the bark had already turned to scripture. The Countess of Chinchon, wife to the Viceroy of Peru, was dying. Fever had taken hold of her body, shaking her so violently that the servants tied her wrists to keep her from falling off the bed. No physician could cool her skin. They had bled her, purged her, anointed her with holy oil, until the room smelled of sweat and candle wax. Still, she trembled. The palace was quiet except for the sound of flies against the plan, window glass, and the low murmur of prayers that no one believed would be answered. It was a Jesuit brother who brought the bark. He arrived at dawn, his robe soaked from the coastal fog, carrying a small vial wrapped in cloth. He said it came from the mountains, from the hand of a woman who spoke with spirits of the earth. The Viceroy's physicians laughed at him. But desperation leaves little room for pride. They mixed the powder into a chalice of warm wine and pressed it to the Countess's lips. She gagged at the taste, whispered a prayer, and swallowed. Hours passed. The candles burned low. Then, at sunset, the trembling began to ease. Her breath slowed. Her pulse steadied. By morning, she slept. The Viceroy, too frightened to believe in miracles, ordered another dose. When she woke, she asked for bread. For the first time in weeks, the servants opened the windows. The city below stirred with the sound of bells, soft at first, then rising, as if Lima itself exhaled. They called it El Polvo de los Jesuitas, Jesuits' powder. Within weeks, the bark became legend. Apothecaries offered fortunes for a handful. Priests wrote of it in their letters to Madrid. The fever that had haunted the tropics for centuries suddenly had a name, and its conqueror, too. Ships left Callao carrying crates marked with crosses. Bound for Europe, the powder was weighed like gold, guarded like relics, prayed over in the holds of ships where men still coughed and shivered in their hammocks. The Countess recovered fully, her cheeks flushed once more, her skin pale and cool as marble. To celebrate, her husband hosted a feast, serving cups of the same bitter wine to his guests, who drank it as though swallowing God's mercy. But for those who had touched the bark at its source, for the villagers who stripped the trees bare, for the woman of the mountain who warned them, it was not mercy they tasted. It was the beginning of a trade that would turn salvation into empire and bitterness into wealth. From that day, the bark had a new name, Cinchona, for the Countess who lived. A cure baptized in blood, faith and profit, the miracle in a chalice that would soon change the fate of the world. The first flakes of powdered bark arrived in Europe like contraband, hidden inside sacks of cacao and tobacco, tucked beneath church relics and silver chalices. It crossed the ocean in silence. When the Jesuits opened the crates in their monasteries, the scent of the Andes rose into the cold European air, sharp, dry, and strangely clean. The brothers called it pulvis sanctus, the holy powder. They believed it to be God's answer to fever, proof that his mercy could be carried in a handful of dust. But mercy, in those days, was a dangerous business. In Rome, the priests of the Inquisition eyed the powder with suspicion. Too many miracles had already turned to heresy. The idea that a cure could come from the hands of a native woman in the pagan mountains unsettled them. Yet in the hospitals of Naples and Seville, where the sick burned under heavy blankets and prayers fell unanswered, the bark worked. The trembling stopped, the skin cooled, even the skeptical began to swallow. Jesuit couriers became smugglers of salvation. They carried the powder in small packets hidden inside their robes, trading it from convent to court. In Paris, a single ounce could buy a year of candles. In London, it could buy a priest his silence. The bark traveled by word of mouth, whispered between healers who trusted miracles more than medicine. Soon, even physicians, men sworn to reason, began to seek it. But the Jesuits kept their secret. They refused to reveal where the tree grew, fearing that greed would strip the forests bare. They told no one of the Quechua woman, nor of the mountain where the air shimmered with fever. Instead, they spoke of divine providence, of the bark as a holy gift meant only for the faithful. They wrapped it in ritual, in Latin blessings and secrecy. Those who received it believed they were touching the edge of heaven. In a monastery near Genoa, a young novice wrote of the powder in his diary. "We mix it with wine," he confessed, "and it brings the fire down from the blood. I have seen men wake from death's door, but I have also seen greed bloom in their eyes." The monks began to hoard it, rationing doses to the wealthy, selling the rest through merchants who met them at night by the cloister gate. When the first English traders caught wind of the miracle, they called it Jesuits' bark and cursed it for its Catholic origins. Still, they bought it. Protestants and Papists alike swallowed the same bitterness, praying to the same God for relief. The irony was not lost on the Jesuits. They smiled behind closed doors, knowing their cure had conquered what centuries of preaching could not, the human body itself. But secrets have their own fever. Within a generation, the bark's origin began to slip from memory, replaced by profit, politics, and imitation. The Jesuits had meant to guard it, but instead they had created a legend. And legends, once loosed upon the world, never stay pure. Somewhere in a Peruvian forest, trees were already falling faster than prayers could be said. Their bark peeled away for a faith that would soon be measured not in souls, but in silver. The streets of London smelled of smoke and vinegar, the scent of a city trying to disinfect itself from the world. Down Cheapside, the apothecary's windows glittered with glass bottles, green, amber, and clear, each one promising a cure, a dream, or a slow death. Inside one narrow shop, beneath a swinging oil lamp, the bark from the Andes sat on a high shelf among jars of arsenic, laudanum, and powdered coral. Its label was handwritten in brown ink, Pulvis Peruvianus, the Peruvian powder. The apothecary himself was a man of calm hands and restless eyes. He spent his evenings grinding, mixing, weighing, a chemist, a merchant, and a quiet confessor to the suffering. Every few minutes, the doorbell rang, and someone came in coughing, shivering, pleading for something to stop the shaking that came with the night air. He would nod, measure a spoonful of the pale, bitter dust, and whisper that it had come from the farthest edge of the world. God's own cure, he called it, though his faith had long since dried up like the herbs hanging above his bench. The powder was expensive, too precious for the poor who lived in the damp cellars by the Thames. Those who could not afford it chewed willow bark or prayed. Those who could swallowed their bitterness with pride. Doctors debated its power, pamphlets praised it, and charlatans copied it. Some mixed chalk into the powder to stretch their profits. Others ground brick dust and claimed it was the same. Still, the genuine bark, the true cinchona, carried something different. It smelled faintly of earth and rain. When boiled, it left a residue like rust at the bottom of the glass. And for those who lay trembling in fever, it brought the closest thing to grace London had ever bottled. At night, the apothecary would close his shutters and sit by the hearth, sorting through his ledgers. The entries blurred together: Peruvian bark, 2 ounces, to Lady Whitmore; 3 drachs, to Surgeon's Hall, £1. He knew the stories behind the names: a child with swamp fever from the fens, a colonel home from India whose blood still buzzed with heat, a young woman pale as wax who fainted whenever the church bells tolled. He wondered if they lived long enough to reorder. Sometimes he dreamed of the forests where the bark was born, trees breathing in the fog, women with steady hands scraping the bark from their trunks, traders wrapping the strips in linen before sending them across the world. He imagined their faces when they learned what London had made of their miracle, a commodity stacked beside snake oil and opium. By dawn, he would wake to the rattle of carriage wheels and the church bells tolling the hour. He would unlock his drawers, measure his powders, and greet the next customer with the same calm voice. "For the fever?" he would ask, already knowing the answer. And so the cure from the mountain became another whisper in the apothecary's shop, another hope sold by the ounce, weighed in silver, and swallowed with faith. In the drawers of London's chemists, empire was beginning to take form, not in cannons or ships, but in tiny spoons of bitterness, dispensed one trembling hand at a time. The air moved like breath through the jungle, slow, damp, and heavy with decay. At dusk, it shimmered gold, and by night, it turned to steam. The British soldiers stationed in Sierra Leone called it the white man's grave, and every month proved them right. From the deck of their ships, the mangroves looked peaceful, green and endless, the rivers silver and still. But beneath that calm surface, the swamp seethed. It sang with insects, bloomed with rot, and carried the invisible bite of death. They came ashore in polished boots and wool uniforms meant for London fog, not African rain. Within a week, the first fevers began. The men shook so hard their teeth cracked. Their skin gleamed with sweat that smelled of iron. They spoke nonsense in the dark, cursing the air that refused to cool. The officers tried to keep order drills at dawn, hymns at dusk, but by the second month, the barracks had turned into a hospital. Beds were lined shoulder to shoulder, and the sound of breathing filled every corner, shallow, gasping, desperate. The doctors called it malaria, though the word was foreign even to them, malaria, bad air. They believed the swamp exhaled poison, that the mists were cursed. To fight it, they burned barrels of tar, covered the windows with muslin, and filled their lungs with pipe smoke to keep out the evil vapors. But the fevers still came, as steady as the tide. The men who survived one attack often died in the next. In the evenings, the regimental surgeon would walk the rows of cots with a lantern, its light trembling across faces hollowed by fever. He kept a small tin box in his pocket, the only thing that seemed to help. Inside, wrapped in wax paper, were tiny crystals of white powder, quinine. He measured a few grains onto a spoon, mixed it with brandy, and pressed it between cracked lips. The men swallowed and coughed, their throats seizing at the bitterness. "Drink," he would say, his voice hoarse. "Drink, and you'll see morning." Some did, many didn't. Letters sent back to England told of miracles and nightmares in the same breath. "The powder saves those it does not kill," one officer wrote. "It is both mercy and punishment." The supply ships carried more quinine than bullets. The bark became as precious as gold, guarded by sentries who understood that without it, every soldier was already half buried. Outside the barracks, the jungle kept its rhythm. The night insects hummed like 1,000 tiny engines, frogs croaked in the flooded ditches. The river carried away the dead men who had crossed the world to plant a flag, only to be consumed by air and water. Yet even as the fever thinned their ranks, the empire persisted. More ships arrived, more soldiers disembarked, more crates of powdered bark were stacked in the heat. They drank, they gagged, they lived, and they built forts where no one was meant to survive. The empire learned that conquest was not only won by the sword, but by the spoon, by the bitter powder that could hold death at bay, one dose at a time. The tropics had claimed thousands, but now, for the first time, the fever met its match. It would retreat, but never disappear, a truce written in sweat, blood, and quinine. The fever had many names. In India, they called it the jungle spirit. In Africa, it was the midnight fire. Among sailors of the Royal Navy, it was simply the sheikhs. But to the empire, that restless machine of men and maps, Malaria, was something far worse. It was an obstacle, a silent insurgent that conquered where no army could. It invaded every expedition, every campaign, every dream of dominion. In Calcutta, the monsoon clouds rolled in like bruises, the streets filled with steam and rot, and the air pressed down with a weight that made even the healthy dizzy. British officers in starched collars and polished boots held their breath walking from one shaded veranda to the next, as if fear alone might keep the sickness away. But the mosquitoes came anyway, invisible, relentless. Within weeks, the barracks were half empty. The survivors lay sweating through their uniforms, their skin yellowed, their eyes glassy as lantern oil. The surgeons did what they could. They bled. The men fed them lime water and prayed over their convulsions. None of it mattered. At the edge of empire, the fever was king. It was as if the tropics themselves had risen in rebellion, refusing to be tamed by gunpowder and prayer. Letters home turned frantic. "We lose 10 men for every mile of ground gained," wrote one colonel. "The jungle does not fight, it simply waits." Bodies were buried in trenches dug at dusk, each marked by a wooden cross that wilted in the rain. The Union Jack fluttered over the graves like a cruel reminder that even glory could rot. Then came the bark. Crates of pale powder from the Andes, carried by ship and mule and miracle. The officers distributed it like sacrament, one spoonful before dawn, another before dusk. "The fever won't touch you now," they said, though no one believed them. The soldiers drank it mixed with gin, the bitterness twisting their faces. But within days the fevers slowed. Some men even stood again, pale but alive. The news spread like scripture. The bark worked. The Jesuit secret had crossed oceans and found its place in the empire's arsenal. The War Office ordered tons of it, stockpiled it in Calcutta, Singapore, and Sierra Leone. Soon, every regiment carried its own supply, packed beside rations and ammunition. But the soldiers whispered that the cure came with a curse. Some claimed the dream started after the 3rd dose, feverless nights filled with the sound of humming wings and the memory of rain on leaves they had never seen. Others swore they could taste the jungle in their sleep, bitter, wet, and unending. Still, the empire endured. Forts rose where men once fell, The red line of Britain's dominion crept across the map like a spreading scar, drawn by men who had swallowed the forest and lived to tell of it. Malaria would remain its oldest enemy, invisible, ancient, patient. Yet it was that invisible war, more than any rebellion or rival nation, that defined the empire's resolve. And with each sip of the bitter cure, Britain learned that survival was not a matter of courage or faith, only chemistry, bark, and the will to keep drinking. It began with rumors whispered in ports from Lisbon to Lima that the mountains of Peru held a tree worth more than gold. Sailors who had seen its bark swore it could stop a fever in its tracks. Merchants listened, priests prayed, and empire builders took notes. Soon, the bark was no longer medicine, it was currency. Ships left London and Amsterdam with empty holds and promises. They returned months later with crates of cinchona, their hulls sweating in the tropical heat, their decks reeking of decay. For every cargo that reached Europe, another sank in storms or succumbed to disease before making landfall. Still, the profits were too large to ignore. The bark trade became a fever of its own, one that infected kings, merchants, and thieves alike. In Lima, British agents arrived in disguise. Posing as scholars or missionaries, they carried notebooks, measuring tapes, and secret orders to find the tree at its source. Local guides led them through jungles thick as nightmares, where vines hung like nooses and the air was heavy with insects. Many never came back. Those who did returned, changed eyes, haunted, hands trembling, clutching a few precious strips of bark wrapped in linen. In the Andes, the people watched strangers climb their sacred slopes with axes and saws. The quinine tree, once harvested with care by healers, was now stripped bare by men who did not understand patience. Entire groves vanished within a decade. The soil eroded, the rivers ran brown, and still the traders wanted more. To them, the bark was not a gift of the mountain, it was a resource, and resources were meant to be conquered. Ships bearing the British flag soon competed with Spanish and Dutch vessels for control of the trade routes. In the Caribbean, smugglers sold counterfeit bark, ground with sawdust and brick. In London, apothecaries argued over whose supply was pure. Each claimed to possess the true Jesuit powder, though none could trace its origin back to the forests that were dying in silence. By mid-century, entire networks had formed plantations in South America, warehouses in Calcutta, auction houses in Liverpool. The bark moved through their hands like smoke, invisible, valuable, unstoppable. Men who had never set foot outside England made fortunes on its bitterness. Clerks in dim offices handled ledgers that smelled faintly of quinine, though they didn't know the word yet. And in every port city, there was always one ship docked longer than it should be, its crew pale and shaking, its cargo guarded by soldiers who coughed into handkerchiefs spotted with red. The fever traveled with the cure, as if the two were bound by some cruel covenant. The bark trade built empires and burned forests. It filled coffers while it emptied graves. By the time the last trees near Loxa were cut down, the British had already begun searching elsewhere, deeper into the jungle, higher into the mountains, chasing the next harvest of salvation. They called it commerce. The Quechua had another word for it: theft. The earth, they said, never forgets what it gives or what is taken without asking. They came by night, men with quiet feet and foreign tongues, their coats soaked in mist, their pockets lined with silver. The Spanish crown had forbidden the export of cinchona seeds, declaring the fever tree a national treasure, but that only made it more valuable. And where there was profit, there was always someone willing to steal. In the high valleys of the Andes, the bark gatherers cascarilleros worked under watchful eyes. Soldiers patrolled the slopes, guarding the groves like they guarded mines. Each tree was logged and counted, its harvest taxed by the ounce. The Jesuits, long since expelled from the region, had left behind their ledgers and their secrecy, but the Spanish administrators had learned quickly. Knowledge was power, and this bark was empire bottled. But the world was changing. The British and the Dutch were no longer content to buy what Spain controlled. They wanted their own fever trees to plant, to breed, to profit from. So they sent their agents, in the guise of botanists, explorers, and natural philosophers, men who spoke softly of science but carried the hunger of merchants in their hearts. One of them, Charles Ledger, moved through the Peruvian markets, pretending to sketch wildflowers. His journal was full of notes about altitude, rainfall, and the shape of leaves. But between those lines were the real treasures, maps of mountain paths, contacts among bark collectors, and names of guides who could be bribed. He knew the risks. The penalty for seed smuggling was death, but disease was killing faster than any firing squad. The fever did not respect borders, and neither would he. He found his ally in a local man named Manuel Incra Mamani, a quiet Quechua farmer with eyes like flint. Mamani knew the old forests, the slopes where the richest trees grew, and he knew how to move unseen. For months they gathered seed pods, drying them in the sun, hiding them in cloth, and sealing them inside clay jars. Every night, Mamani whispered to the trees for forgiveness. "We take what they will never return," he said. By the time Ledger reached the coast, half his porters were dead from fever, and the rest had fled. The crates he carried looked ordinary, just another shipment of dried herbs and resin. Inside them lay the future of medicine. He bribed a captain to hide the cargo beneath sacks of cocoa bound for Europe. The ship left Callao at dawn, its sails burning gold in the morning light. Mamani never saw it go. Arrested by Spanish patrols, he was beaten and left to die in the forest that had raised him. His body was found weeks later, his hands still stained with bark dust. Ledger's seeds would cross oceans and continents. They would germinate in Java and Ceylon, under foreign suns, guarded now by Dutch soldiers instead of Spanish. Within decades, the monopoly of the Andes would be broken. The fever tree would grow in foreign soil, its roots spread wide, its origin forgotten. But the price was written in mountains left bare, in villages emptied, in one man's unmarked grave beneath a silent canopy. They called it progress. Ledger called it salvation, and the bark, indifferent as ever, went on whispering to the rain. In the year 1822, French chemists named Pierre Pelletier and Joseph Caventou locked themselves inside a small laboratory on the Rue Jacob in Paris. The air there was thick with the smell of acids and alcohol, and the walls were stained the color of smoke. For weeks they worked in near silence, boiling, filtering, and grinding the bark that had traveled from the Andes through smugglers' hands and customs bribes. The Jesuits had once guarded its secret with prayer. Now, science was about to dissect it with glass and flame. Pelletier was the steadier of the two, thin, cautious, methodical, while Caventou was restless, prone to muttering theories aloud, his hands perpetually stained yellow from chemical burns. They had been studying plants and their hidden poisons for years, morphine from poppies, strychnine from seeds, and now the mystery of the Peruvian bark. Apothecaries sold it by the ounce, but no one truly knew what gave it its power. The Frenchman believed the answer lay in extraction, the art of separating the sacred from the soil. The bark hissed as they mixed it with lime and ether. The smell was overwhelming, bitter and metallic, filling the room like invisible fog. On the fifth day, as the liquid cooled, small white crystals began to form along the edges of the flask, delicate, gleaming, like frost caught in sunlight. Pelletier leaned closer, squinting. "There," he whispered. "That's it. That's what saves them." They had isolated the active principle, a pure substance, crystalline, tasteless at first, then searingly bitter on the tongue. They named it quinine, from quina quina, the Quechua word for the bark that had started it all. For the first time, the healing spirit of the fever tree had been trapped, quantified, and weighed. Nature's miracle now had a formula. Word spread quickly. The French Academy applauded the discovery, and within months, chemists across Europe began producing quinine in bulk. It was a triumph not just of medicine but of empire. No longer would the cure depend on smugglers and mountains. It could be made, refined, replicated. The bark was no longer sacred, it was science, but the taste remained. Those who took it described it as a bitterness that clung to the throat and lingered in the blood. Soldiers in India called it the devil's dust. Sailors said it made their dreams turn green. Yet they drank it all the same, for the alternative was fever, and fever meant death. Pelletier and Caventou refused to patent their discovery, believing it belonged to the world. But the world belonged to empire, and empire did not share. Pharmaceutical houses rose overnight laboratories that smelled of lime and profit. The Dutch saw opportunity, the British saw strategy, and both saw control. In Paris, the two chemists continued their quiet work, unaware that their crystals would soon rewrite the boundaries of the map. What began as an act of curiosity became the foundation of conquest. The age of exploration had found its elixir and its justification in a flask of bitterness. The year was 1834, and the air above Calcutta shimmered with heat. The British cantonments, laid out in perfect squares of dust and stone, were already wilting under the monsoon sun. Inside the barracks, soldiers sat stripped to their shirts, faces grey from exhaustion, their belts loosened, their skins slick with sweat. Flies hummed over tin cups filled with a cloudy liquid, the new medicine from Europe. The officers called it quinine, the men called it the bark. It was poured by order, swallowed by fear. The ritual was as strict as drill. Every dawn, before breakfast, a sergeant with a ledger would stride down the line, his boots crunching on the baked earth. Dose, he barked, and the men would hold out their tin mugs like offerings. The mixture powder stirred into tepid water, or gin burned the tongue, curled the stomach, and left a taste that could not be washed away. Some men spat it out when the officer turned, others pinched their noses and drank. The few who refused were carried to the hospital within days, shivering and delirious. Quinine became the empire's invisible weapon. For every musket polished and every bayonet sharpened, there was a bottle of white powder packed beside it. Soldiers marched through jungles and marshes that had once swallowed entire regiments, now armed not only with rifles but with chemistry. The fever still came, but less often. Campaigns that once ended in graves now ended in victory. A handful of bitter crystals had tilted the balance between man and nature. In the officers' mess, the talk was of conquest and climate. Maps lay spread across the tables, their edges curling from humidity. A captain from Bombay traced a line across the Deccan Plateau. "We could never have done it before," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "The bark makes it possible." Another officer, glass in hand, lifted a toast. To the bottle and the bayonet, the twin pillars of empire. The laughter that followed was hollow, but no one dared admit it. Yet the cure came at a cost. The daily doses blurred the senses, hollowed the appetite, and made some men see things that weren't there. One soldier swore he heard the jungle whisper at night, a low, rhythmic pulse like breathing. Another said the trees watched him, but their commanders only reminded them, the fever kills faster than madness, and so they drank. By evening, the barracks smelled of sweat, tobacco, and the faint chemical sting of quinine. The soldiers cleaned their rifles in silence, the sound of oil on metal mixing with the far-off calls of nightbirds. Beyond the walls, the jungle glowed with fireflies, thousands of tiny blinking embers, as if mocking the flicker of human endurance. In London, Parliament toasted the triumph of British medicine. In India, the soldiers drank bitterness and built empire brick by brick, one swallow at a time. Quinine had become as much a part of the uniform as the bayonet, invisible, mandatory, and merciless. It conquered no land by itself, yet without it, no land could be conquered, and thus the cure marched beside the army, a ghost in every bottle, a weapon in every cup. It began as a trick of taste, a soldier's small rebellion against medicine. The British regiments in India had been forced for years to swallow their daily rations of quinine, mixed with water so foul it turned the stomach. The powder settled like chalk at the bottom of the cup, and the bitterness clung to the tongue for hours. Men would curse, gag, and joke that they'd rather face fever than another dose. But one evening, under a heat-thick dusk that smelled of sweat and oranges, an officer in Bombay tried something new. He poured his ration into a glass of gin, added a squeeze of lime, and watched it fizz. He lifted it to his lips and grinned. "Better," he said. Word spread through the garrison faster than any order. Soon, every officer's table carried bottles of gin and limes beside the medicine chest. The bitterness of quinine met the sharpness of citrus and the bite of alcohol, and something remarkable happened. It became drinkable. A miracle turned into a pleasure, a dose into a toast. The soldiers raised their glasses under the tropical stars and laughed that the cure for death finally had a proper taste. Thus was born the gin and tonic, the drink that would become the unofficial anthem of the British Empire. The colonels called it civilized hydration. The surgeons called it compliance. The soldiers called it salvation in disguise. Each evening they drank to their health, though what they really drank to was endurance, the small comfort of control in a land that defied them at every turn. The drinks spread beyond the barracks, into clubs and parlors, verandas and drawing rooms. By the 1840s, quinine tonics were being bottled for export, their labels promising vitality under the tropic sun. What began as a soldier's necessity became a symbol of refinement. In Calcutta's grand hotels, officers' wives sipped tonic water laced with lemon slices, pretending not to taste the medicine. At Empire, day celebrations, glasses clinked under chandeliers, and guests toasted the Queen with a drink born of disease. Every bubble carried history: the bark of a Peruvian tree, the labor of Indian workers who crushed and dried it, the sweat of men who had marched through jungles haunted by fever. Yet no one thought of those things. They thought only of the coolness, the crystal, the faint shimmer of empire in a glass. In the tropics, quinine became not just a cure but a ritual, a boundary between life and death, comfort and decay. The jungle pressed close, its night insects droning like machinery, but behind their mosquito nets, the English drank their bitterness with a smile. To live was to endure the taste. To endure it was to belong. By the time the 19th century turned, no officer was without his daily glass. The gin dulled the loneliness, the tonic kept the fever away, and together they numbed the conscience. It was more than a drink, it was a disguise for survival. Every sip said the same thing: the empire will not fall. Not tonight. Not while the glass is full. The barracks at Fort William in Calcutta were built like a fortress, but inside they felt like a tomb. Each long room was lined with wooden cots, their sheets grey with sweat, and the red dust that crept in from the parade ground. The air hung heavy, motionless, thick with the scent of lime wash, medicine, and fear. At dawn, the heat was already unbearable. By noon, it pressed against the walls like a hand. Flies gathered in the corners, mosquitoes hummed in the dark rafters, and somewhere, always, a man coughed. The fever never struck the same way twice. Some men burned hot within hours, thrashing and gasping until their muscles gave out. Others froze, shivering under their blankets though their skin was slick with sweat. They spoke in fragments names, prayers, curses. Their eyes rolled white. At night, when the lamps burned low, the barracks echoed with their delirium. Whispered pleas for water, cries for home, the thud of a body convulsing against the floorboards. The living learned to sleep through it. The dying learned to whisper quietly. The regimental surgeon, a pale man named Dr. Hewitt, moved through the rows with a basin and a bottle. His coat was always damp, his face glistening under the lamplight. He had lost count of how many he had saved or buried. The quinine came in small glass jars from London, brittle things that cracked in the heat, and each morning he rationed them like gold. He mixed the powder into gin and water, stirred it with the handle of his penknife, and lifted the mug to a trembling mouth. "Steady," he murmured. "Steady now." Some men resisted the dose until their fever made them obedient. Others swallowed it with the same resignation they gave to orders. A few begged for more, believing the bitterness itself held the power to keep death at bay. Hewitt kept his notes in a leather-bound journal, columns of names, temperatures, Symptoms: the handwriting grew smaller each day, as if he were trying to save space or time. When the fever passed, the men returned to their drills like ghosts. Their uniforms hung loose on their bones, their eyes were hollow. They marched because it was the only thing that reminded them they were alive. In the evenings, they sat outside, watching the horizon bleed into the river, their cups of tonic trembling in their hands. They joked about how the mosquitoes were smarter than the generals. They laughed because the alternative was remembering. By the end of the year, the barracks cemetery had doubled in size. Each grave was marked by a small wooden cross, the names written in chalk that washed away with the monsoon rain. Yet the supply ships kept coming, unloading crates of quinine beside rifles and tea. The fever would rise again with the next rains, as it always did. Still, the men endured. They believed in their bitter ritual, a daily swallow of suffering that promised another sunrise. The fever had taught them its cruel arithmetic. Life was measured in men, spoons of powder and inches of bark. And in those barracks, beneath the relentless hum of insects and the slow ticking of the surgeon's watch, empire survived one trembling heartbeat at a time. The ledger lay open on the surgeon's desk, its pages stained with sweat and ink and the faint ring of glass bottles. Every morning, before the bugle called the men to drill, Dr. Hewitt dipped his pen into the inkwell and began again. He wrote slowly, methodically, a ritual of names and numbers: Private J. Larkin, fever broken; Corporal T. Hensley, relapse; Sergeant Wilkes, deceased. The handwriting was careful, almost reverent. To miswrite a letter felt like erasing a man twice. Behind him the infirmary breathed its heavy rhythm, the clink of spoons, the wet rattle of lungs, the drone of flies that no one could kill fast enough. Quinine dust coated every surface, a fine white powder that turned the surgeon's fingertips bitter and his lips dry. He had long stopped tasting it. When he drank his own nightly dose, it was without expression, as if bitterness were now part of his blood. The army demanded records, lists, tallies, proofs that the medicine worked. They measured health in columns, not faces. Every 2 weeks, a clerk came from the garrison office to collect the pages, flipping through them with bored precision. Steady improvement, he would say, nodding. Hewitt never argued. The numbers always looked cleaner than the truth. But at night, when the camp settled into silence, the surgeon sometimes added his own notes between the lines, small, human fragments hidden in the margins. Private McAdams asked for a letter home. Young O'Rourke spoke in his sleep mother's name, Eliza. Captain Farr died quietly, no pain. It was his way of remembering that these were not statistics, but men who had once laughed, gambled, cursed, and believed they would live forever. The quinine ration was never enough. Crates arrived late, broken, sometimes spoiled by the humidity. Hewitt would measure what remained on his brass scale, deciding who needed it most. Officers, always. Then those strong enough to recover, the hopeless, the ones too far gone to swallow, he marked with a dash and turned away. Mercy had no place in arithmetic. One evening, as a thunderstorm gathered over the river, he sat by the window with the ledger on his knees. The lightning illuminated the page for an instant, rows of names inked across the paper like the bars of a cage. He realized that each line was a pulse, a breath, a man's last word turned into record. He closed the book gently, as if afraid to wake them. When the storm broke, rain lashed through the shutters, soaking his notes. The ink bled into the paper until names and numbers became one long, dark smear. Hewitt watched without moving. He thought of the fever, how it washed through the body, erasing distinction between hot and cold, between life and death. The rain was doing the same to his ledger. By dawn, the pages had dried, warped but legible enough to send to command. He rewrote what he could, added new names, began again. The work of empire, he understood now, was not measured in victories or flags, but in ledgers like his, heavy with loss, bound in leather, and smelling faintly of quinine. Each page was proof that the bitter cure worked, and also proof that it never worked enough. By the 1840s, the forests of Peru were growing thin. What had once stretched in endless green waves along the slopes of the Andes now stood broken stumps, bleeding sap, hillsides stripped bare where bark had been cut too deep to heal. The cinchona trees were dying faster than they could be found, their silver trunks left to rot beside the trails that wound down to the coast. The local gatherers, cascarilleros, were exhausted. They had climbed for decades through mist and shadow, slicing bark from trees older than their grandparents. Now there were fewer and fewer left to find. Still, the demand did not stop. Every season, ships arrived from Europe with new contracts and heavier orders. London wanted more powder, Calcutta wanted more shipments, the Empire wanted more control. The bark was measured in tons, not trees, and the buyers never saw the land that bled for them. From Lima to Loja, men were paid by weight, not care. Each kilo of bark was worth a month's wage, and so they cut until nothing remained. One cascarillero, a young man named Diego, had worked the slopes since he was 12. His father had taught him how to peel the bark cleanly, how to leave enough for the tree to live. But that kind of patience no longer paid. Now, foremen demanded speed trunks flayed whole, branches stripped in minutes. Diego knew it was wrong. The forest was thinning, the birds fewer each year. The river that once ran clear now carried mud the color of rust. Yet when his child fell sick with fever, Diego climbed higher and cut deeper, praying to the same mountain he was wounding. At night, fires burned on the ridges where crews dried the bark before carrying it down on mules. The smoke smelled sharp, bitter and sweet at once, like medicine and mourning mixed together. Traders from the coast waited below, weighing the loads by lantern light. They haggled in Spanish, tallied in ink, and sealed the sacks with wax. For every 10 mules that began descent, one slipped on the cliffs and was left where it fell. But the bark always reached the sea. The ocean was patient. It took everything. In Europe, gentlemen in velvet chairs drank quinine tonic from cut crystal and spoke of progress. They called the deforestation the price of civilization, though they would never see the bare slopes or the brown rivers. For them, the bark was a triumph of science over savagery, a symbol of man's command over nature. In the journals of the Royal Society, cinchona was praised as a resource, not a living thing, but a material for empire. Diego died in his 31st year, his lungs filled with dust from the bark he harvested. His son would take his place, as his father had before him. By then, the trees near their village were gone, and men were being sent farther east into Bolivia and Colombia. The fever of demand had outlasted the fever it claimed to cure. On the docks of Callao, crates were stacked high for London, each one, filled with the forest's last breath. When the ships sailed, they left behind silence where birds once sang, and a bitter scent that clung to the mountains long after the traders were gone. In the humid dawn of 1854, a Dutch botanist named Justus Haskell stood on the deck of a ship bound for Java, staring at a small wooden crate chained to the mast. Inside, packed in moss and hope, were the seedlings of the cinchona tree, stolen from the dying forests of the Andes. Each fragile sprout represented a revolution. If they survived the voyage, Holland would no longer need to buy Peruvian bark. The monopoly of the New World would end, and a new empire of medicine would rise from volcanic soil. The theft had been planned in whispers. Spain guarded its bark trade with muskets and bureaucracy, but greed is an infection no border can contain. Haskell had been sent to South America under the pretense of studying flora. In truth, he was there to steal life itself. Guided by local collectors, men who had already seen their forests vanish for foreign coin, he gathered seeds from the last surviving Cinchona calisaya trees. The journey nearly killed him. Fever took his assistant. The mountain rains destroyed half the seeds. The rest he wrapped in damp cotton, hidden beneath drawings of orchids and ferns. When he finally reached the coast, his hands were trembling from exhaustion and guilt. Months later, as his ship neared the port of Batavia, Haskell opened the crate for the first time since Lima. Against all odds, the seedlings were alive, pale, fragile, but alive. He wept, though whether from triumph or terror he couldn't say. Within a year, the first cinchona plantations rose in the misty highlands of Java, where cool air met tropical rain. Dutch scientists studied every leaf, every vein, breeding stronger, more potent trees. What had taken nature centuries to perfect, they reshaped in a generation. The British watched with quiet fury. For decades they had relied on Peruvian bark for their colonies, now they would have to buy it from their rivals. Dutch Java became the new heart of the quinine trade, and with it the balance of power shifted east. Fortunes were made not in gold but in bitterness. Each year, the plantations produced more bark than all of South America combined. The Dutch had not just stolen a tree, they had stolen an empire's immunity. In Batavia's laboratories, technicians in linen coats ground the bark into powder, the air heavy with dust that burned the throat. Ships left the harbor carrying tons of quinine bound for every tropical outpost in Europe's dominions. To the men who loaded those ships, it was simply another cargo. To the world's soldiers, it was survival. Back in Peru, the forests continued to vanish, but now their loss no longer mattered to the markets. The world had moved on, and the Andes were forgotten. The Dutch had learned to grow fever trees in rows, neatly spaced like soldiers, a plantation army against death itself. When Haskell died years later, his journals were sealed in a university archive, his name recorded as a hero of science. But the Quechua elders, who still walked among the stumps of their ancestral groves, remembered another story of a foreigner who took the mountain's heart and planted it in another man's soil. They said the wind over the Andes still carried his name, spoken not in gratitude, but as a warning of what men will do when salvation becomes property. By the 1860s, the British Empire had learned to fight its oldest enemy not with bayonets, but with bottles. The crates that once carried muskets and gunpowder now held vials of quinine white crystals sealed in wax and stamped with the royal crest. They were shipped from London to Bombay, from Java to the Cape, until every regiment, every frontier post, every missionary's satchel smelled faintly of bark. The empire, for all its cannons and cavalry, had found its truest weapon in bitterness. On the Indian frontier, where the Ganges curled through steaming jungles and the air pulsed with the hum of mosquitoes, soldiers took their doses like prayers. Each morning, a bugle called, not for battle, but for medicine. "Line up for life," the sergeant would shout, and the men would shuffle into rows, cups in hand. They drank their quinine mixed with gin or lime water, the taste sharp as iron, the ritual unending. It became a kind of discipline, a ceremony as vital as loading a rifle or sharpening a blade. The fever still came, but less often, and when it did, the men recovered faster. They learned to march through swamps that had once killed their predecessors in weeks. Outposts that had been abandoned years before were reclaimed. Flags rose again where only vines had grown. The newspapers in London called it the triumph of science over savagery. In truth, it was survival disguised as superiority. The new medicine gave commanders something they had never known before: endurance. Campaigns that would have collapsed under the weight of disease now stretched for months. Roads were built through jungles, rail lines cut through the hills, rivers mapped, villages charted. And with each expansion came the quiet hum of quinine bottles clinking in their cases. The powder became empire's pulse, measured not in doses, but in miles gained. In the officers' mess, quinine took on a different meaning. It was proof that the empire's reach was ordained, that even nature, that ancient and impartial force, had yielded. They toasted to the bitter mercy, as one general called it, unaware that the plantations in Java and India now thrived on the labor of men who would never see the inside of those fine glass decanters. For every ounce of quinine swallowed by a soldier, another was ground from the bark, stripped by brown hands under a foreign sun. And yet, there was reverence for the medicine, too, a strange, grim devotion. Soldiers swore by it, Missionaries carried it beside their Bibles, explorers packed it alongside their compasses. Some even wore small pouches of the powder around their necks, as if it were a charm against the fever's invisible curse. By the time the century's middle decades bled into the next, quinine had become inseparable from conquest itself. It was not just a cure, it was a passport, a permission slip from the earth itself that allowed pale men to survive where they were not meant to live. The bark had become a weapon more potent than any rifle, for it conquered without firing a shot, and so, under a sky thick with heat and insects, the empire pressed forward, its soldiers' hearts beating to the rhythm of the same bitter cure that now defined them. Each sip was a victory, each swallow an act of dominion. The fever had met its match, and in the dark reflection of that triumph, something colder began to grow, the illusion that immunity meant right. By the last quarter of the 19th century, the world itself seemed to blush beneath the weight of empire. On the great maps that hung in London's drawing rooms and military colleges, vast swaths of Africa and Asia glowed crimson, the color of dominion, of order, of British ambition stretched to the horizon. But behind that red tide lay the pale dust of cinchona bark. The color of the empire's triumph was, in truth, the color of its cure. In the age before quinine, the tropics had been a graveyard, the white man's grave. They called it the equator ringed by death. But now the borders crept outward. Colonies that once killed their conquerors bloomed into settlements. The British planted gardens, railways, churches, and, always, fever trees. The jungles were mapped and measured, their chaos trimmed to fit the angles of imperial geometry. In Calcutta, in Lagos, in Singapore, men in linen suits spoke of destiny. The fever had not disappeared, but it had been subdued, domesticated, like everything else. Ships arrived daily from Java, their cargoes heavy with quinine. Glass jars gleamed in the sunlight, their labels neat and clinical. Sulfate of quinine, standard dose. The powder was packed into crates, stamped with the crest of the East India Company, and sent into every corner of empire. Where there was red on the map, there was quinine. Where there was quinine, there was conquest. In Africa, explorers pushed inland along rivers whose names still shimmered with myth: the Niger, the Zambezi, the Congo. Before the fever tree, no European expedition had survived these lands for long. Now, the explorers drank their daily draughts and pressed deeper, drawing borders through forests they could not understand. They took samples, measurements, photographs, proof that the wilderness could be tamed. Every drop of quinine swallowed became a line on a map. Every heartbeat sustained another step of empire. In London, Parliament toasted too, the expansion with champagne. Politicians spoke of civilization, commerce, science. They said quinine had freed the world from ignorance, made it safe for progress. But the progress they praised was written in someone else's blood. The plantations that produced the bark were worked by men who had never seen the red lines on those maps. To them, quinine was neither miracle nor medicine. It was labor, backbreaking and endless, its reward measured in survival. When the new atlases were printed, schoolchildren traced their fingers over the red continents and felt pride. They did not know that the color was bought with bitterness, with bark stripped from trees a hemisphere away, with sweat and sickness and silence. The maps told a story of expansion, but not of erosion, of lands made empty, of cultures made small, of forests reduced to powder. The fever, for all its cruelty, had been honest. It asked no allegiance, recognized no race. The empire that replaced it demanded both. And as the century wore on, the red on the map grew deeper, a spreading stain that no amount of tonic water could ever wash away. The bark had saved the soldier, but it had also saved the empire's illusion that its reach was righteous, its rule inevitable, and its color eternal. The road to the mission wound through fields of elephant grass that swayed like fire under the noon sun. The air shimmered, heavy with the perfume of rain and rot. Beyond the village, the mission house stood on a small rise, whitewashed walls, a wooden cross fixed above the doorway, and a brass bell that hung silent most days. The man who lived there, Reverend Samuel Briggs, had come from Sussex with a Bible in one hand and a case of quinine in the other. He believed both could save souls. He would learn that only one truly could. Briggs kept his journals in neat handwriting, his words soaked in faith and humility. "The Lord provides in strange ways," he wrote on his first night in Africa. "This powder, bitter as sin, drives the fever from the body. I mix it with water and prayer, and the men rise from their beds." The villagers called the medicine the white bark. They watched its effects with cautious awe, how the trembling stopped, how the heat in the skin faded, how men who were ghosts at sunset stood by dawn. They said the Reverend carried a forest inside his chest. But miracles, like empire, are never free. For every life saved, 2 were spent in labor, the bark harvested under the sun by men who did not know where it went or why it mattered. The Reverend never asked. He dispensed his doses faithfully, weighing the powder on a brass scale beside the crucifix. Each spoonful was a conversion. The fever broke, and gratitude followed. "They come to Christ through the cure," he wrote. "Perhaps suffering itself is the key to belief." His wife, Eleanor, saw things differently. The heat had withered her from the moment they arrived. The quinine kept her upright, but its bitterness crept into her dreams. She began to hear the bell ringing at night when it wasn't, began to smell the bark, even when the bottles were sealed. "This place hums with sickness," she whispered. "Not of the body, of the soul." Briggs tried to soothe at her, dosing her as he did the others, but the lines in her face deepened until she looked older than the land itself. One evening, a storm came without warning, a deluge that beat against the roof like fists. Lightning struck the field where the bark powder had been drying, and the smoke carried through the mission windows. The Reverend ran outside, shouting for help, but no one followed. They watched from their huts as he tried to save the medicine, coughing and staggering, clutching the crates as if holding salvation itself. By dawn, the rain had washed the powder into the mud. Eleanor found him kneeling in the ash, his hands stained white, his eyes hollow. In his final entry, the Reverend's handwriting faltered. "The fever takes many forms," he wrote. "One of them is faith." He died a week later, not from malaria, but from exhaustion, a heart undone by zeal. The villagers buried him beneath the cross he'd raised and left a strip of bark at its base, a token of respect. They said he had brought them medicine, but also dreams that burned too bright. When the next missionary arrived months later, he found the bell rope torn, the powder gone, and the air still smelling faintly of quinine. The cross leaned slightly in the wind, a monument not to victory, but to the quiet sickness that came when mercy and empire shared the same cup. In the parlours of London, progress had a pleasant taste. It fizzed, sparkled, and was served over ice. Bottles of Indian tonic water, once a soldier's medicine, now gleamed behind polished glass counters at chemists' and gentlemen's clubs. "Health in a glass," the advertisement said. The tonic promised vigor for travelers, clarity for scholars, and protection for those bound for distant colonies. No mention was made of where the bark came from, nor of the men who bled the trees. The bitterness that had saved the empire was now refined into fashion. It was the age of glass and brass, of mirrored bars and marble floors. Quinine was poured into everything: pills, cordials, wines, even lozenges for ladies of delicate constitution. At soirees in Mayfair, men in tailcoats boasted of the empire's scientific miracles while sipping cocktails that glowed pale gold under gaslight. "We have conquered the tropics," they said. "The world is ours to cure." In the same breath, they toasted to expansion, to trade, to profit, to progress itself. But progress, as ever, left a trail of ghosts. In India, laborers on the cinchona plantations worked knee-deep in mud, their hands raw from stripping bark, their wages barely enough to buy food. The trees, arranged in perfect rows, no longer resembled the wild forests of the Andes. They were factory lines of green, producing salvation for strangers. The overseers kept ledgers, not prayers. Each tree was numbered, Each worker accounted for, each ounce of quinine tallied like ammunition. The empire no longer needed faith, it had inventory. Back in Europe, the factories hummed. Steam engines pressed, dried, and bottled the powder into tablets marked British Standard Strength. The air inside those factories was dry and acrid, tasting faintly of medicine and money. Girls in cotton aprons packed the pills into boxes, unaware that the dust settling on their skin came from the same bark that once grew under Andean rain. They joked that they'd never catch a fever while they worked here. Some were right, most simply coughed for years. The newspapers praised it, all the ingenuity, the enterprise, the triumph of science over nature. No empire has ever been so enlightened, one editorial claimed. We bring civilization, and with it, health. Few cared that quinine had turned into a commodity traded on the stock exchange, its price rising and falling with the monsoon rains. Even fewer noticed that malaria still thrived in the colonies, shifting, adapting, learning the pattern of human arrogance. In quiet corners of the city, doctors began to wonder what else might be hidden inside the bark, whether the same bitterness that cured might also corrupt. A few even whispered that the tonic had become too comfortable, too indulgent, its true purpose forgotten. But their voices were drowned beneath the clink of glasses, the applause of investors, the applause of empire. So the world drank and called it progress. The quinine slipped down the throats of soldiers, merchants, and debutantes alike, a universal bitterness disguised as elegance. Beneath the gaslit glow of London's optimism, no one saw how deep the shadow of that bitterness had already spread into the forests, the factories, the blood, and the map itself. At the edge of the River Clyde in Glasgow, where the water turned the colour of soot and glass dust shimmered in the air like frost, stood the great tonic water factory, a cathedral of steam and iron. The year was 1872. The world was thirsty, and the empire had learned to bottle its cure. The factory ran day and night. Whistles shrieked with the dawn, and hundreds of workers poured through the gates, women with sleeves rolled to the elbow, boys with soot-streaked faces, men whose lungs rattled when they laughed. The air inside was thick with the smell of sugar syrup, quinine, and metal polish. Along the long rows of machines, glass bottles clinked endlessly, passing from hand to hand like a prayer chain of progress. At the far end of the hall, copper vats hissed as they boiled water laced with the bitter powder from Java. The supervisors wore white coats and pocket watches, their boots shining, their voices drowned by the roar of steam. They spoke not of medicine, but of output. How many crates could be shipped to Liverpool? How many to Bombay? How many to the gentlemen's clubs of London, where tonic was now poured beside the gin, not as cure, but as culture? On the upper floor, where the air was hotter still, girls filled the bottles and sealed them with corks. They moved quickly, their hands raw from the heat, their aprons streaked with syrup. The glass cut their fingers. They kept working. At every shift's end, their fingertips tasted faintly of quinine, sharp, metallic, and medicinal. "Better than fever," one girl said once, and another laughed without smiling. Downstairs, a foreman named Macready kept the ledgers. Each morning he ran his thumb down the columns: cinchona powder from Java, 20 crates, sugar, 50 barrels, output 100,000 bottles. To him, the numbers sang. They were proof that empire could be engineered, refined, and sold by the crate. He never wondered about the forests the bark had come from, or the workers who harvested it. To him, the medicine was a formula, not a story. Every afternoon, the factory's delivery carts rattled down the cobbled streets, carrying the glittering bottles to the docks. The labels bore an image of Britannia seated on her globe, spear in hand, a lion crouched at her feet. Beneath, in gilded script, it read, "Quinine tonic water, the imperial refreshment." Housewives bought it for its supposed health. Soldiers drank it for duty. Gentlemen sipped it for pride. At night, when the factory fell silent, the floor still smelled of iron and bark. The echo of bottles clinking in the dark was like the ticking of a clock, steady, mechanical, eternal. The empire had found a way to preserve its pulse. By the time dawn broke, the workers were back at the gates, faces pale under the smog, ready to repeat the same motions. They did not see themselves as part of history, just a chain of hands feeding a hunger that never stopped. But every bottle that rolled out of that building carried more than tonic. It carried a memory of mountains stripped bare, of bitter bark turned sweet, of progress bottled, corked, and shipped to every corner of the red-stained world. By the 1880s, the tonic that had once been swallowed by grim-faced soldiers in fever tents now shimmered in crystal flutes on drawing-room tables. What began as medicine had become fashion. Society ladies in London, pale and powdered beneath the glow of gaslight, lifted their glasses of quinine water with the same delicacy they gave to pearls and gossip. The bitterness that once made men gag in the tropics was now a mark of refinement, a small, controlled suffering disguised as sophistication. They called it the ladies' glass. At luncheons in Belgravia and Kensington, women in lace gloves and high collars would sip it between courses of roast and syllabub, remarking on its invigorating taste. The advertisements promised youth, clarity, and continental vigor. Some claimed it brightened the complexion, others that it prevented melancholy. The truth, unspoken but widely known, was that it made their hearts flutter and their hands steadier, a tonic against both faintness and the suffocating boredom of a life lived in drawing rooms. In the shop windows of Bond Street, bottles gleamed beside perfumes and powders. Their labels featured images of tropical forests, noble explorers collecting bark, natives smiling beneath palm trees, the empire distilled into a fantasy of paradise. The ladies who bought them saw none of the mud, none of the blood. They saw only grace in a glass, civilization captured in effervescence. The tonic promised vitality without consequence, adventure without danger, the exotic made domestic. At home, servants wheeled in silver trays bearing carafes of the drink, the bubbles rising like clockwork. Husbands drank theirs with gin, wives took it plain, sometimes with lemon, sometimes with a cube of sugar, to soften the edge. They spoke of its moral purity, its cleansing nature, as if the taste itself could absolve. But when the guests had gone and the candles guttered, many found themselves awake, past midnight, their nerves buzzing faintly, their tongues dry with bitterness. It was as if the empire had crept inside them, efficient, unyielding, sleepless. Quinine had become more than a cure. It was a symbol. To drink it was to align oneself with progress, with order, with the steady pulse of empire that beat from London to Calcutta. A glass of tonic water was a statement of faith in the modern age, in science, in industry, in control. And yet, behind every crystal flute, lay the shadow of a forest that no longer existed. The bark that had given the empire its health had also taken its innocence. Occasionally, one might overhear a whisper, a missionary's wife recalling the forests of Java, a botanist's daughter mentioning the laborers who stripped the trees until their hands bled. Such stories were dismissed with polite discomfort. Progress has its price, someone would murmur, and the conversation would drift to safer topics. Fashion, rainfall, the Queen's latest speech. And so the ladies drank. Their laughter filled the air, delicate and practiced, like the chime of cut glass. The bubbles rose and burst, leaving no trace. To them, the bitterness had become beautiful, a fleeting reminder that even comfort must sting a little to feel real. They never knew that with each sip, they were tasting history itself, the flavor of a world conquered, condensed, and served cold. The soldiers called them the quinine visions. They came in the hours just before dawn, when the body burned but the air turned cool, that thin line between waking and delirium, where the cure blurred with the sickness. Men who had survived the fever said it wasn't sleep at all, but something closer to haunting. The bitterness that saved their blood seemed to linger in the mind, turning thoughts to glass, stretching time like the fever itself had refused to leave. In the barracks outside Calcutta, Private James Henley began to speak of it first. He had taken his daily dose, a spoonful of powder mixed with gin, and gone to bed with the rattle of monsoon rain on the roof. In the night, he saw the forest, enormous trees with silver bark, roots that shone as if wet with stars. From their branches hung lanterns that were not lanterns at all, but small beating hearts, pulsing faintly in the mist. A voice whispered from somewhere behind him, saying the same word over and over, bitter, 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 until he woke gasping, his mouth dry, the taste still clinging to his tongue. By morning his bunkmate had the same story, then another, then half the barracks. They laughed it off at first, soldiers' talk, the side effects of a strong stomach and a weak mind. But when a corporal in Burma wrote home describing identical dreams, trees bleeding bark, rivers that ran white instead of red, the officers grew uneasy. The quinine, it seemed, had a way of binding its takers together in visions too consistent to be coincidence. The medical officers noted the complaints but dismissed them. A trivial symptom of excessive dosage, they wrote. Hallucinations caused by prolonged exposure to the tropic sun. And yet, those who took the smallest amounts saw just as much. Some dreamed of the mountains where the bark was born, though none of them had ever been to the Andes. Others heard faint hymns, sung in languages they couldn't name. A few claimed to see the faces of the native gatherers who stripped the trees, their eyes hollow, their hands still moving even after they'd vanished. It was said the bitterness opened a door in the mind, a taste so ancient it carried memory within it. After all, quinine was not new. It had lived in the veins of the earth for centuries before men found it. Perhaps, the soldiers whispered, the forest remembered them now. Perhaps the cure carried the fever of the world. In the medical ledgers, the phenomenon was reduced to one line. Subjects report dreams of unusual vividness. No further study recommended. The empire could not afford superstition, and so the men kept drinking. Each night, the barracks fell silent, save for the low hum of mosquitoes and the restless turning of bodies in their cots. Some prayed before bed, others drank extra gin to drown the dreams. But nothing could stop the visions. The fever had left their bodies, yet something of it remained, a memory stitched into their blood by the very cure that saved them. And so they lived between two worlds, one waking, one remembered, where the bark of a tree could speak and the darkness itself had a heartbeat. It was the price of survival, to see the empire not as progress, but as dream, fever, and echo, all carried in the same bitter taste. By the time Victoria had ruled 4 decades, the fever no longer terrified the empire. It had been tamed, or so people believed. Men no longer whispered of ghosts in the blood, they spoke instead of immunity, a new word that tasted of triumph. The soldiers who marched across swamps and savannas no longer trembled at the hum of mosquitoes. They carried quinine in their kits, drank their daily ration without flinching, and wrote home that the tropics were no longer fatal, only inconvenient. But immunity, like empire, was never free. In the humid hills of Ceylon, where the air smelled of cinnamon and mud, Dr. Harold Wainwright conducted his experiments. He called it preventive dosing, a daily amount so strong that the fever would never take hold. His journals were meticulous, his conscience less so. Each morning, his volunteers, Tamil laborers, promised extra pay, lined up beside the plantation hospital to swallow the white powder mixed with sugar water. They grimaced, coughed, swallowed again. Some collapsed after a week, their hearing fading, their eyes blurring. The doctor recorded their symptoms in neat ink: tinnitus, vision disturbance, trembling in limbs. He never used the word poisoning. Back in London, the War Office applauded the results. A triumph of modern medicine, they called it. Wainwright's reports were reprinted in the Lancet, and soon every regiment from Lagos to Rangoon adopted the same regimen. Quinine was no longer merely a treatment, it was a defense, a chemical armor. The soldiers joked that they were half bark by now, their blood as bitter as the forests it came from. They wore their immunity like medals, unaware that it came at the cost of slow ruin. The side effects were subtle, creeping. Men began to lose their hearing, first a faint ringing that never stopped. Some went blind in one eye. Others found their hearts beating irregularly, their nights filled with tremors instead of dreams. The doctors called it synchonism, a minor inconvenience compared to death. Orders remained unchanged. The dose must be maintained. The empire could not afford weakness. The tonic that once saved lives now began to consume them. Still, no one questioned it. In the empire's arithmetic, it was better to keep a soldier deaf and alive than silent in the ground. The body was expendable so long as it could march. The bark had turned from healer to overseer, demanding obedience, promising survival at a price none could refuse. In the officers' clubs, the older men laughed about it. "We've grown immune to everything," they said, raising their glasses of tonic. They were right in ways they didn't understand. The bitterness no longer registered on their tongues. The forests that birthed the cure were gone. The people who discovered it forgotten. And in that forgetfulness, something more dangerous than fever had taken root. The belief that immunity was a form of right, that endurance was the same as virtue. The empire had conquered disease, or so it told itself. But beneath the glittering surface of progress, the bark still whispered its lesson. Every cure is a covenant, every immunity a debt, and the interest, though unseen, would always come due. By the 1890s, the slopes of southern India were carved into order. What had once been jungle now stood in rows, endless green terraces of Cinchona legeriana, the most potent fever tree in the world. The British called the plantations gardens, though there was little of Eden left in them. The land had been purchased, fenced, and measured. Its people recruited under contracts, signed with thumbprints instead of names. To the empire, these hills were not alive but productive, another machine in the long chain of empire's industry. The planters' war, as it came to be known, began not with rifles but with roots. The soil was tired. Years of stripping bark from the same trees had weakened them, and disease spread through the groves. Bark yields fell, profits followed, London demanded more. The overseers, Englishmen in white suits and wide hats, turned to coercion. Labourers who once worked from dawn to dusk were now driven before sunrise, their wages docked, for every leaf deemed damaged. Women carried baskets twice their weight up the steep hills. Children followed behind, collecting scraps. In one plantation near Tarkamund, the workers finally refused. For weeks, whispers passed between the rows that the earth was cursed, that the trees were dying because they were being forced to grow where they did not belong. When the overseer raised his whip against a man who would not cut, the others dropped their knives. They stood silent, hands at their sides, refusing to move. The overseer shouted, threatened, struck one of them in the face. Still, they did not move. The rebellion lasted less than a day. By sunset, troops had arrived from the nearby garrison. 12 were arrested, 2 never returned. In London's reports, the incident was summarized in 6 words: minor unrest among the native laborers. But among the hills, it became legend. The workers called it the day the trees stopped singing. The wind that night moved, differently, colder, as if the forest itself was ashamed. Within a decade, the plantations recovered. New hybrid trees, bred in laboratories, produced more bark than ever before. The empire congratulated itself on its victory over both nature and man. The same overseers who had ordered the beatings now posed for photographs in front of the endless rows, their boots clean, their hands gloved. They spoke of duty, of civilization, of stewardship. They believed the land had been improved. Yet, the soil told another story. The rain no longer soaked as deeply, the birds no longer nested, the rivers carried silt that glimmered with the dust of quinine. The earth itself turned medicinal, bitter to the taste. In Calcutta, bottles of tonic water still bore the proud label from the Cinchona plantations of India. No one in the city saw the hills or the men who climbed them barefoot. The tonic had become invisible, its origin erased behind the neat geometry of supply chains and profits. The planters' war left no monuments, no medals, no heroes. Only ghosts of trees, of laborers, of a land that once healed itself. And though the bark still cured fever in faraway places, here in the shadow of the Nilgiris, it had become something else entirely. A wound that never stopped growing, trimmed and tended until it learned to look like progress. The letters began as a way to pass the evenings. The monsoon rains came early that year, drumming against the tin roof of the hill station bungalow, and Eleanor Hartley found herself alone more often than not. Her husband, Captain Thomas Hartley, oversaw the new cinchona plantations that climbed the slopes above Utakamund. His days were long, his hands stained brown from bark dust, and his nights were spent poring over ledgers filled with figures and yields. So Eleanor wrote to her sister in Bath, to her mother in Dorset, to anyone who might still remember the sound of rain on English rooftops. "My dearest Clara," she began one evening, "I can hear the jungle breathing." It was true. At night, the forest moved like an animal, sighing, creaking, alive. The insects hummed so loudly it was as though the air itself vibrated. The hills smelled of quinine and wet stone, a sweetness that curdled into bitterness with each passing hour. Sometimes she thought she could feel the trees watching her. Her letters were full of contradictions. "The mornings here are beautiful," she wrote in one. "Mist curls between the ridges, and the sunlight spills like gold dust through the leaves. But by afternoon, the air turns heavy, and I cannot breathe. It is as if the earth itself resents us." Thomas read her letters before they were sent. He said the tone was too melancholy. "England must not think us miserable," he told her. "This is a post of pride, the fever is our enemy, and we are winning." She smiled and nodded, then wrote new letters at night, ones he never saw. Those she kept hidden between the pages of her Bible, written in a finer, smaller hand. "The workers cough blood," she confessed. "Their eyes are hollow, their hands raw. The overseers say it is the bark dust, but I think it is despair. They sleep among the stripped trees. I wonder if the cure they harvest will ever reach them." In another, she wrote, "The hills are scarred. Now, what was green when we arrived is pale and bare. They call it improvement. I call it forgetting." When the fever struck Thomas in late autumn, he laughed at first. "A soldier of the Empire cannot be beaten by a mosquito," he said. But by the second day, his skin burned, and his eyes rolled white beneath their lids. Eleanor fed him quinine dissolved in gin, the smell filling the room until she could taste it in her teeth. She prayed, though she no longer believed in prayer. He survived, but something in him changed. He grew quieter, less certain. The ledger stayed open, but the numbers no longer satisfied him. When he finally returned to work, he did so with a limp, his hands trembling as he cut the bark. "We live," he told her one night, "because of this tree, and yet everything around it dies." Months later, Eleanor's letters stopped reaching England. The postmasters said the rains had washed out the roads, that the jungle had reclaimed the paths. In truth, there were no letters left to send. Her final one, never posted, remained on the desk. The hills are silent now. Even the wind has turned bitter. When her bungalow was found years later, the pages were still there, each one spotted with mold. The ink faded to brown, the scent of quinine clinging faintly to the paper. It was not a story of conquest or cure, but of witness, a woman who saw the world's bitterness turn from fever to faith, and from faith to ash. By the turn of the century, empire had moved indoors. The jungles and plantations still whispered their old stories of fever and labor, but in London, the new frontier was glass and gaslight. Rows of polished counters, brass scales, and bottles labeled in Latin became the landscapes of conquest. Here, in the heart of civilization, men in white coats held the future in their hands. Quinine, once scraped from mountain bark by bleeding fingers, now poured from the mouths of machines. At Burroughs and Wellcome on Snow Hill, the laboratories ran day and night. The smell of alcohol, bark dust, and steam clung to the corridors. Rows of chemists, young and grave, moved among beakers like priests in a quiet cathedral. The hum of progress was constant, valves hissing, typewriters clacking, the soft shuffle of ledgers being balanced. They called their work pharmaceutical imperialism, though few spoke the words aloud. The bark had become Empire's heartbeat, and London its brain. The process was now perfected. Raw cinchona from Java arrived in crates lined with tin. In the extraction rooms, the bark was ground, soaked, filtered, crystallized, and refined into pure quinine sulfate gleaming like frost. From there, it was measured into tablets, tinctures, and tonics, sealed in brown glass with labels that promised salvation. Burrows and welcome, purity, efficacy, empire. The slogan was printed on every bottle. Sir Henry Wellcome himself liked to say that the chemist's flask was the new sword of civilization. "We bring the light of science to the dark places of the earth," he declared at a Royal Society banquet. The guests applauded, unaware or unwilling to know that the same light glowed dimly in the eyes of the factory workers who spent their days inhaling quinine dust until their skin tasted of bitterness. In the export offices, clerks mapped the world with pencil and string. Red pins marked each colony supplied with quinine: India, Burma, Nigeria, Ceylon, Malaya. Every vial that left the port was logged, numbered, and tracked. The Empire's veins pulsed with precision. Medicine had become a ledger, and the ledger was life. Doctors, once seen as healers, were now administrators of Empire's endurance. The cure was no longer personal, it was policy. Malaria was not an illness, it was an obstacle to trade. The bark, stripped from its human cost, had been transformed into strategy. Each shipment carried not only powder, but power, the means to settle, to govern, to endure. At the height of production, over 100 tons of quinine left London every year. Yet few in the city remembered where it came from. The Andes were a myth now, the forests reduced to footnotes in scientific journals. The people who had first brewed the bark's bitter tea were ghosts at the edge of memory. Still, the Empire grew fat on its medicine. The chemists toasted their discoveries with tonic and gin, their glasses catching the light. Like liquid silver, they called it progress. But beneath the clinking of crystal and the hum of the machines lay something quieter, the echo of a tree's sap drying in the sun, a reminder that even purity has a source, and every empire of science stands on roots it has long since forgotten. By the last decade of the 19th century, the empire had learned to drink itself into permanence. What had once been a soldier's ration, quinine dissolved in gin and lime, had become a ritual of identity. The gin and tonic was no longer medicine. It was empire, distilled and carbonated, served in crystal or tin depending on one's station. It was how the British marked the hours in every corner of the world, from Cairo's verandas to Rangoon's officers' clubs, from the highlands of Kenya to the back alleys of Singapore. The drink was as common as the Union Jack, as defining as the accent that ordered it. Evenings began the same way everywhere. The red sun set over red soil, the punkahs swung lazily overhead, the air humming with heat and insects. A servant in a white tunic would carry in the tray the gin, the bottle of Schweppes Indian tonic water, slices of lime already drying at the edges. The glasses sweated before they were touched. The officers laughed too, loudly, pretending not to hear the jungle pulsing beyond the veranda. Each sip was both a comfort and a claim. They were not visitors here, they told themselves. They were administrators of destiny. The drink in their hands was proof that science had conquered the tropics, that the fever which once humbled them now existed only as a memory in the taste of the tonic. At the Bombay Club, gentlemen in linen suits held competitions over who could mix the perfect ratio, just enough gin to dull the bitterness, just enough lime to suggest civilization. They quoted Kipling, discussed the Queen's Jubilee, and spoke of the great work of governance. The tonic sparkled under the gas lamps like bottled obedience. To decline, it was to reject the Empire's unspoken creed, that endurance was duty and pleasure its rightful reward. The drink followed them home, crossing oceans on the same steamships that carried tea and opium. In London drawing rooms, it became a novelty, the colonial cocktail. Aristocrats sipped it as they recounted tales of elephant hunts and railway inaugurations, of savages pacified and wilderness tamed. The bitterness they tasted was exotic, thrilling, safe. None thought of the hands that stripped the bark or the mouths that swallowed it to survive. In advertisements, the drink was called the mark of the modern man. Posters showed explorers raising their glasses against the jungle, women smiling beside phonographs, doctors endorsing it as the ideal refreshment for the enlightened. The tonic had become myth, a liquid assertion that the empire had not only conquered disease, but had turned suffering into sophistication. But, under the veneer of civility, the bitterness lingered. In the outposts where the fever still struck, men died clutching their glasses, half-finished drinks sweating in the heat. The jungle did not care for ritual or refinement. It waited, patient as ever. The empire could bottle its cure, but it could not cure its conscience. In the years to come, the gin and tonic would survive every rebellion, every retreat. When the flags came down, the drink would remain the taste of empire preserved in ice, sugar, and lime. And every time it was poured somewhere in the glass, if one listened closely enough, the forest still whispered through the fizz. Bitter, bitter, bitter. They came home changed. Not all at once, not in ways that London could see, but in the slow, quiet decay that clung to their eyes and voices. The soldiers of the tropics, those who had fought the jungle, the fever, and the silence, returned to England with medals on their coats and tremors in their hands. They called it the bark's bite. The doctors called it fatigue. But to the men who had swallowed quinine every dawn of their service, it was something else. A lingering ghost of the empire's cure. In boarding houses from Portsmouth to Manchester, they gathered thin, tanned, coughing into their handkerchiefs. They smelled faintly of lime and spirits. Their skin, once burned brown by the Indian sun, seemed almost translucent now, veins tracing blue lines like rivers on a forgotten map. Many could no longer hear properly. The ringing in their ears never stopped. Some saw flickering shapes in the corners of rooms, shadows that vanished when they turned their heads. Others woke drenched in sweat, tasting metal, and remembering jungles that were oceans away. In pubs, they drank the very thing that had unmade them. The gin dulled the noise, the tonic gave it purpose. For old time's sake, they said, lifting their glasses to the light. Their laughter sounded like something rehearsed. The bitterness no longer bothered them. Their tongues had grown accustomed to it. They drank to remember, and they drank to forget, often in the same breath. Wives and mothers tried to make sense of it. The men who came home were not the ones who had left. They were quieter, watchful. The children learned not to wake them suddenly. More than one boy had been struck when his father came up shouting from a dream. Some men couldn't stand the sight of green anymore. They claimed the color made them ill. One burned every houseplant in his garden. Another, a former sergeant, was found pacing the woods outside Birmingham at dawn, muttering about mosquitoes that weren't there. The newspapers called them heroes of the tropics. They were paraded on Empire Day, medals polished, uniforms pressed, the crowds cheering, as if fever had been a battle won by courage alone. No one spoke of the side effects, the sleeplessness, the slow poisoning that ate at their nerves. Medicine was progress. Progress demanded silence. Those who survived long enough to grow old often died in hospitals that smelled faintly of disinfectant and citrus. Doctors puzzled over their hearts, their hearing, their dreams. None traced it back to the white powder that had once been salvation. None thought to ask whether the cure had simply demanded its due. When the century turned, a new generation of officers sailed east, young and unbroken, carrying bottles of quinine with the same faith as their fathers. The old veterans watched them go and said nothing. They had learned that bitterness never really leaves the blood, it only quiets, waiting. On certain damp evenings, when the fog rolled in thick from the river, the men gathered again in the back rooms of pubs, where the smell of gin met the whisper of damp bark. They drank in silence, their eyes distant, their hands shaking just enough to make the glass tremble. Outside, London pulsed with life and empire, unaware that its might rested on the shoulders of men hollowed by medicine, men who had conquered the fever but never truly escaped it. By the dawn of the new century, London believed itself immortal. The empire stood at its height, its armies vaccinated, its ships stocked with quinine, its citizens confident that disease was a relic of the primitive world. The tropics had been domesticated, its jungles charted, its medicines bottled. Malaria was no longer seen as an enemy, but a conquered subject, tamed by science and empire alike. Yet far from the polished streets of Piccadilly and the marble steps of Parliament, the fever still waited, not defeated, only patient. In West Africa, in Burma, along the deltas of the Mekong and Niger, it lingered in the water, in the soil, in the breath of dusk. Every year, new soldiers arrived, younger and more certain than the last. They unpacked their quinine tablets beside their rifles and maps, laughing at the warnings of the old hands. "The fever's finished," they said. "We've bottled the cure." But the mosquitoes returned with the rains, as they always had, as constant as the beating of wings against glass. In a hospital in Sierra Leone, a nurse named Mary Godfrey kept a small notebook of the dead. The entries were neat and merciless. Sergeant Atwell, 27, relapse. Lieutenant Graham, 30, fever, severe, pulse irregular. Private Lacey, 19, convulsions. The British sent crates of quinine and new instructions from London. Double the dosage, add sugar to disguise the taste, improve morale. But the deaths continued. The new strain of fever was different, slower, more cunning. It waited weeks before showing itself, hiding between the doses, learning the rhythm of its own defeat. Mary wrote in her journal one evening, "It feels as though the fever learns us. We swallow the bark, and it changes its skin. It comes back stronger, quieter, closer to the heart." Her handwriting faltered there. The next line trailed off into a stain of ink. She died 3 months later, the fever finding her despite the medicine she measured out for others. Meanwhile, in London, the Royal Society held a lecture titled "The Vanquishing of Malaria." Charts were shown, medals awarded, champagne poured. No one mentioned the plantations still stripping bark from the hills of Java, or the workers coughing in the quinine factories, their skin grey with chemical dust. No one read Mary's name aloud. The empire was too vast to hear its own echoes. In the colonies, the people who had once watched the Europeans die from the fever now watched them build hospitals, railroads, and cemeteries. They called the disease by their own names still: Nadoki, Book, the breath sickness, and they knew it could never truly die. The fever was not just in the blood, it was in the air, in the soil, in the greed that turned medicine into power. By the time the 20th century began to roar with machines and wireless dreams, the fever had already crossed back into the cities that thought themselves cured. It hid in ports and alleys, in ships' ballast, water, and in the bodies of men returning from war. It whispered in every pulse, waiting for the moment when arrogance would taste again what bitterness truly meant. The empire thought it had beaten the fever, but the fever had merely learned to wait patient, invisible, as all debts are, and somewhere, deep in the silence between heartbeats, the old rhythm continued, the pulse of wings, the hum of dusk, the faint, eternal taste of quinine on the tongue. They were born in faraway heat, in bungalows shaded by palms, in barracks on the edge of rivers where the water never stopped moving. They were the children of the empire, neither fully English nor fully native, raised under suns that burned their heritage into ambiguity. Their fathers were soldiers, doctors, or surveyors, men who had swallowed quinine for years, their veins humming faintly with the memory of fever. Their mothers were sometimes British women who wilted in the humidity, sometimes local women who knew how to survive it. The children carried both inheritances in their blood, endurance and exile. In the early years, they grew up among the rhythms of duty, the morning bugle, the measured drills, the hiss of tonic being poured into glasses on the veranda. They learned the rules of survival early: not to play outside at dusk, to sleep beneath nets, to drink their medicine without complaint. They watched their fathers swallow the white tablets as if they were sacraments, and their mothers fan themselves under portraits of a queen who had never felt tropical air. The bark's bitterness became their inheritance, its taste passed down like a family name. When they reached a certain age, they were sent home. That word meant England, though few remembered it. The voyage was long, the sea indifferent. They arrived pale and seasick, their accents strange, their eyes too bright. The schools called them the Colonials. They were too foreign to be British, too British to be anything else. They missed the smell of rain on red earth, the hum of cicadas, the taste of lime in water. They could not explain that even the quiet in England sounded different, colder, empty of the fever's breath. The boys grew into officers, the girls into wives. They carried the empire with them, in their habits, their careful posture, their clipped manners, their belief that order could outlast memory, but something inside them remained restless. At night, they dreamed of the lands they'd left, of wide rivers and moonlit hills, where the trees whispered in languages they'd once known. Some woke with the old taste of quinine on their tongues, though they hadn't touched it in years. In time, they returned as administrators, missionaries, engineers, the second generation of conquest. They built schools and churches, drew borders and laws, spoke of modernization. Yet when the fever came again, as it always did, they too reached for the bottle of tonic, the glass of gin, the ritual of their fathers. The bitterness reminded them of safety, of belonging, of the strange unity between power and vulnerability that had defined their lives. History would forget most of them, the in-between children who lived between borders, who carried empire not in their uniforms or their titles but in their blood. They left behind diaries filled with the language of two worlds, written in a tone neither proud nor guilty, but weary. "We are," one woman wrote in 1910, "the children of the fever, born from its cure, raised in its shadow. We will never belong to either side of the medicine." And when the empire began to crumble decades later, it was their voices, quiet, lucid, unanchored, that would linger. The children who had grown immune to everything but memory, the heirs of quinine, whose blood still carried the faint, metallic song of survival. By the early 20th century, empire no longer wore armor, it wore white coats. What began in the jungles and the fever barracks had migrated to the marble counters of pharmacies, to the gleaming storefronts that lined the streets of London, Calcutta, and Singapore alike. The word pharmacy itself became imperial, a place where the illnesses of the world were conquered, bottled, and sold. The bark that once saved dying soldiers now sat behind polished glass, measured in ounces and pence. Inside those shops, everything smelled faintly of alcohol, sugar, and antiseptic. The shelves gleamed with promise-patent elixirs, bark tonics, digestive bitters, all tinged with the ghost of quinine. For vigor, the labels read. For clarity, for life in the tropics. Each bottle carried the same secret, a trace of bitterness, the same ancient powder that once came from the mountains of Peru. Clerks in waistcoats spoke of dosage as though reciting scripture, their hands steady as they folded receipts embossed with the royal crest. In London, the chemists were businessmen now, not explorers. Burroughs, Wellcome, Bayer, their names were carved into stone above doorways, their laboratories humming with the quiet thunder of machines. They built an empire of medicine to mirror the empire of maps, each colony a market, each disease an opportunity. Their advertisements filled newspapers, bright illustrations of smiling families, of tropical sunsets, of the modern age without fear. Beneath the slogans, the bark's lineage remained invisible, its bitterness disguised beneath sugar and progress. In Calcutta, the same shops glowed at dusk, their signs painted in gold and English. Local clerks sold quinine tablets to workers who could not read the labels. To them, the medicine was both blessing and betrayal, the symbol of a world that could cure their fevers but not their hunger. The tablets were bitter enough to bring tears, Some took them as instructed, others spat them into the gutter. Still, the empire kept count, recording the doses dispensed as proof of benevolence. At sea, on the great liners that linked the colonies to the capital, quinine was served with dinner. In the smoking rooms, gentlemen clinked glasses of tonic water and spoke of sanitation and civilization, as if both could be measured by the number of pharmacies a nation possessed. They never saw the factories that made the powders, where women coughed in the white dust until their lungs burned. They never saw the villages that still trembled under the fever, beyond the reach of science or empire alike. Medicine had become morality. To distribute quinine was to claim righteousness. To refuse it was to invite ruin. The empire now sold salvation by the gram, not by the gospel. The chemist's counter had replaced the altar, and the customer's trust replaced faith. Each coin dropped on the counter was a small absolution proof that suffering could be purchased, that bitterness could be domesticated. By the 1920s, London's pharmacists spoke of malaria as history, but in the tropics, the fever still burned. In the quiet hours of night, the same insects hummed in the same dark air, carrying with them the same old rhythm, blood, breath, and memory. Behind the counters of empire's pharmacies, the bottles gleamed like trophies, their labels bright enough to hide the truth, that the fever had never been cured, only civilized. By the 1920s, the world's supply of quinine no longer came from the misted slopes of Peru or Bolivia. It came from the regimented plantations of Java, a Dutch colony turned laboratory, where the fever tree had been transformed into an industry. From Batavia to the highland gardens of Bandung, Cinchona legeriana grew in obedient rows under the careful eyes of colonial botanists and armed overseers. What had begun as theft had matured into monopoly. The Dutch called their creation the Garden of the World. The Cinchona Bureau in Amsterdam managed it like a bank, calculating harvests, setting prices, manipulating global markets with the precision of merchants rather than scientists. More than 90% of the world's quinine flowed from their warehouses. Every empire that once prided itself on independence, the British, the French, even the Americans, now depended on Dutch bark to keep their colonies alive. In Java's hills, where the air still smelled of rain and volcanic ash, the plantations worked in silence. Thousands of Javanese laborers trudged barefoot along the narrow terraces, carrying baskets heavy with bark. They worked from dawn until the mist burned away, the white dust clinging to their arms like frost. Overseers in khaki coats measured their loads, paid them in copper coins, and kept the best bark for export. In the evenings, the workers boiled rice and whispered stories to their children that the trees were not trees at all, but ghosts of the mountain, punished to stand forever. Every strip of bark was logged, sorted, and sent down the rail lines to the docks at Batavia. There, under the white sun, cargo ships waited to carry the empire's lifeblood across the sea. The crates were branded with Dutch stamps, neat letters, red wax, and the seal of control. The sailors who loaded them joked that they were shipping bitterness itself. They weren't wrong. Back in Amsterdam, the directors of the Cinchona Bureau met in rooms that smelled of cigars and money. They charted global demand with pencils and compasses, their maps of trade as detailed as any general's plan for war. "We sell health," one of them said, "and health is the most dependable commodity of all." And so the price of quinine rose and fell like the tide, binding the world's armies, traders, and missionaries to Dutch soil. Britain protested, of course. So did France. They called the monopoly unfair, unnatural, unchristian. But behind their outrage was fear, the fear that without Java's bark, their soldiers would die, their colonies would rot, their red lines on the map would fade. And so the governments paid. They signed contracts, pledged gold, and swallowed their pride alongside the powder. In Java, the soil itself began to weaken. The forests that once shielded the Cinchona from wind and sun had been cleared to make room for more trees. The rivers ran brown, the bark grew thinner, the alkaloid weaker. The botanists adjusted their formulas, adding chemicals, refining extraction methods. The illusion of control persisted. By the eve of the Second World War, the Dutch held the world's pulse between their fingers. Every bottle of quinine, every soldier's ration, every glass of tonic water, all traced back to those hills. The fever had made the empire rich, and now the cure had done the same. But in the quiet, humid nights above Bandung, when the wind moved through the leaves, the trees still whispered in their ancient tongue of mountains stolen, of bitterness multiplied, and of a world that mistook control for health. The world went mad in the summer of 1939, and with it, the trade in bitterness. When war erupted in Europe, ships that once carried quinine from Java were rerouted for troops and munitions. The lifeline of the tropics was severed overnight. In London, military doctors panicked. The empire's armies were vast, scattered across jungles and deserts, where malaria was still waiting, patient and unchanged. Every nation suddenly realized that their survival depended not on weapons or will, but on a white powder born of foreign soil. The Dutch, confident in their monopoly, promised steady supply, but in 1942, when Japan swept through the Pacific like fire through dry grass, everything changed. The plantations in Java, those neatly ordered rows of Cinchona legeriana, fell under occupation within weeks. Japanese soldiers marched through the highlands, their boots crushing bark dust that had once been worth more than gold. They seized the warehouses, the drying houses, the laboratories. Quinine now belonged to the Axis. For the Allies, it was catastrophe. The American and British forces advancing through Burma and the South Pacific began to fall, not to bullets, but to fever. Men shook in their tents, their eyes glassy, their bodies drenched. In some regiments, malaria claimed more lives than combat. Commanders wrote desperate cables, "Send quinine, any amount." But there was none to send. The world's supply had been captured by the enemy. Scientists were pressed into service as urgently as soldiers. In Washington, laboratories turned to the impossible task of creating synthetic quinine. Chemists in London and New York worked by lamplight, surrounded by piles of Andean journals, crude sketches, and memory. They boiled, crystallized, and failed. The fever could not wait. In the field, doctors turned to substitutes: atabrine, plasmokin, bitter yellow powders that worked just enough to keep men alive, but left them nauseous, jaundiced, and trembling. "The cure is worse than the disease," soldiers said, and still they swallowed. Meanwhile, the Dutch botanists in exile tried to smuggle seeds out of Java before the Japanese arrived. One, a man named Van der Veen, hid his samples inside a suitcase of children's toys and fled aboard the last ship to Ceylon. He made it barely. From those few seeds, Allied agronomists began planting fever trees in Africa and South America, racing the calendar. They called it the War of the Bark, and though no cannon fired, it was as decisive as any battle. When the Allies finally retook the Pacific, they found the plantations ruined. The trees had been stripped bare for bark, the soil exhausted, the workers vanished. Quinine, the empire's invisible weapon, had turned to ash in the hands of conquerors and conquered alike. Yet from the chaos came something new, a revelation that the world could no longer rely on any one forest, any one power, to keep death at bay. After the war, laboratories would perfect the synthetic form of the drug, banishing forever the need for mountains and laborers. But in those dark years, men learned what the empire had forgotten, that the fever never really surrendered, and that the cure could vanish as easily as the next shipment lost at sea. The bark that had built empires had finally waged its own quiet war and, for a time, had won. The war had ended, but the fever had not. Across Asia and Africa, the fields lay hollow, and the forests stood in uneasy silence. The plantations of Java, stripped bare by occupation, were skeletal remains of their former order rows of pale stumps where once the air had smelled of sap and rain. When peace came, it did not bring recovery. It brought insects. The mosquitoes returned first. They came in black clouds that blurred the horizon, rising from flooded paddies and abandoned trenches. War had broken the pattern of control, irrigation systems neglected, canals clogged, ditches turned to breeding grounds. The soldiers had gone home, the governments were broke, and the bark that once kept the fever at bay was scarce or counterfeit. The jungle, long wounded by empire's hand, had found its opening. In the summer of 1946, the first great post-war epidemic began in Ceylon. The hospitals overflowed before anyone could count the dead. Reports from the villages spoke of whole families lost within days, of fields left unharvested, of children delirious beneath mosquito nets that offered no salvation. Doctors from Britain and America arrived with crates of synthetic quinine, but it was too little, too late. "It feels," one of them wrote, "as if the earth is reclaiming its debt." The fever spread with the monsoon. Burma, Siam, the Malay Peninsula each fell in turn. The insects bred faster than the factories could produce tablets. Men who had spent the war fighting fascism now fought the air itself. The disease crossed rivers, borders, and empires alike. Governments blamed one another. Neglect, they said. Mismanagement. But the truth was simpler. The jungle was no longer passive. It was reclaiming what had been stripped from it, the balance, the silence, the slow rhythm of decay and renewal that had been broken by the hunger for bark. In the old Dutch gardens near Bandung, a scientist named Willem de Bruijn walked among the fort, ruined trees, notebook in hand. He had once overseen their cultivation, charting the alkaloid content of each strain with pride. Now he found the ground overrun with weeds and wild orchids. The fever trees that survived had twisted into strange shapes, their bark dark and bitter even to the touch. They seemed to have changed, he noted, as if they no longer recognize us. The locals said the same, that the trees had turned against man. Some refused to harvest them at all, fearing the ghosts of those who died stripping their ancestors bare. The irony was not lost on the scientists. The same forests that had been dismembered for their cure now harbored the disease once more. The mosquitoes nested in the shadows of the fever trees. Their hum filled the very air that quinine had once purified. It was as if the jungle had decided to become its own revenge, a reminder that no cure lasts forever, and that control, once broken, cannot be easily restored. By the decade's end, DDT would begin to fall from airplanes, white powder dusting the fields like the ghost of the bark. But even then, the mosquitoes endured. The fever still flickered in the blood of children and colonels alike. For all its victories, humanity had learned nothing new, only that the jungle, when wounded long enough, always finds a way to strike back. By the 1950s, the war was over. The empires were crumbling, and the fever had become an echo rather than a scream. Yet its ghost lingered not in the jungles alone, but in the conscience of nations that had built their strength upon its cure. The world had entered an age of science, of reconstruction, of optimism. The newspapers spoke of peace, prosperity, and penicillin. But beneath the headlines, a different kind of sickness brewed, a quiet unease that progress might not have been salvation after all. Quinine had done its work. It had saved armies, built trade, and paved the way for empire. Now it was being replaced by new synthetics, chloroquine, primaquine, mepecrine, drugs easier to make, easier to sell, and less bound to the memory of trees. The bark was no longer needed. The plantations of Java, once the beating heart of global medicine, were abandoned to weeds. The white laboratories of Europe took their place, sterile and humming, where men in goggles and gloves created bitterness by formula instead of harvest. The transition was hailed as triumph. "We have outgrown nature," a Dutch scientist wrote proudly in 1952. "The age of dependency is finished." Yet in the places where the bark had once grown, dependency remained. Only now it had changed form. The workers who had stripped the fever trees for a century were left jobless, their land too exhausted for rice. Their children left for the cities, carrying with them lungs still coated in dust and the faint taste of quinine that never left their mouths. In Europe, the tonic survived not as medicine, but as memory. The drink that had once kept soldiers alive became a relic of sophistication, a sparkling symbol of empire polished clean of its origins. Advertisements showed smiling couples under electric light, not soldiers under mosquito nets. Tonic for the modern age, the posters declared, as if the bitterness itself had been reborn as pleasure. For those who remembered the bark, the cutters, the carriers, the widows who watched men die in the heat, the taste carried something else. It was the flavor of ghosts, a sweetness built upon pain. Writers began to take notice. In letters, novels, and post-colonial essays, the story of quinine reappeared like an old fever returning in the night. Historians called it a medicine of contradictions. How could one cure so many and wound so much? How could a substance that saved lives also bind the world in hierarchy and hunger? No one had answers. Progress had already declared itself victorious. Its ledger balanced in profit, not penance. Yet the bitterness refused to fade. It lived on in glass and blood, in the last doctors who still measured quinine by hand, in the villagers who still boiled bark for fevers, in the descendants of those who once called the trees sacred. The world had moved on, but the taste remained, faint and persistent, like a memory the tongue could not forget. The fever had been controlled, the forests forgotten, and the bottles repurposed for pleasure. But for those who listened closely, there was still a whisper under every clinking glass, the same word murmured through centuries of conquest and cure alike: remember. By the middle of the 20th century, the fever tree had vanished from conversation, yet its ghost stood quietly behind every bar, every lounge, every glittering hotel veranda from London to Nairobi. The empire itself was dissolving, one colony after another, slipping into independence, but the gin and tonic endured. It had outlived the maps that made it necessary. In the ruins of empire, the drink remained, a liquid inheritance that no government could dismantle. In England, advertisements for tonic water no longer showed soldiers or missionaries. They showed leisure. The tropical sun that once symbolized peril now promised paradise. On the beaches of the Caribbean and the lawns of Kenya, white men in short sleeves lifted sweating glasses beside swimming pools built where fever hospitals once stood. The taste of refreshment, the posters read, the mark of refinement. The bark's origins, the forests stripped, the workers broken, the debt unpaid had been erased, reduced to a single flavor note: bitterness. The corporations that once trafficked in bark had learned to rebrand. Burroughs and Wellcome became Wellcome Laboratories. Schweppes became an empire of its own, exporting its Indian tonic water across the globe. The name lingered like a secret confession: Indian, but bottled in London; tonic, but no longer medicine. The colonial past had been carbonated, sugared, and sold back to the public as nostalgia. To sip tonic water in the 1950s was to drink empire distilled into myth. In Nairobi's colonial clubs, the British administrators who stayed behind clung to their rituals. The empire was gone, but the routines of authority persisted. Every evening at 6, the bell rang for sundowners. Ice cracked in glasses. Gin met tonic. Lime was cut thin as paper. To civilization, they toasted a word that no longer had borders but still carried weight. Outside, the streets filled with songs in Swahili, drums echoing down from hills that had once been silent under curfew. The empire's heartbeat had changed rhythm, but the glass still glowed with its afterimage. Back in London, ex-servicemen and civil servants filled the pubs of Chelsea and Kensington, trading their khaki for suits. The taste of quinine clung to them. "You never lose it," one said, tapping the rim of his glass. "Reminds you you're alive." But it reminded him of more: the heat, the insects, the bodies buried in red earth, the smell of rot and gin mixed with the rain. He did not say these things. He only drank, and the bitterness spoke for him. By the 1960s, the drink had become democratic. Pop stars and politicians raised it alike, its colonial heritage now hidden behind neon lights and ice buckets. The empire had dissolved, but its chemistry remained a global appetite for the taste of conquest without its cost. In bars from Singapore to Sydney, tonic became the last shared language of a world that had once bowed to the same flag. And so the empire survived not in lore or territory, but in habit in a glass that glittered in the twilight, its bubbles rising like memory itself. The fever tree was gone, its roots forgotten, but the drink endured, clear and bright, carrying the faint, eternal bitterness of history. The tonic had become the empire's last illusion, a toast to victory that had long since turned to ghosts. The forest was gone. The laboratory had taken its place. In the aftermath of war and empire, the world entered a new faith, not in prayer, nor in conquest, but in chemistry. The bark of the cinchona tree, once the lifeblood of empires, was now obsolete, replaced by formulas inked onto whiteboards and sealed in glass flasks. Science had succeeded where nature had resisted, or so it claimed. It began in Germany, in the quiet corridors of I.G. Farben, where men in white coats worked to mimic what the Andes had once given freely. They broke the molecule apart, then rebuilt it, until they found a way to produce the fever's antidote without a single leaf or tree. The world cheered. Synthetic quinine, the miracle of modernity. No more jungles, no more laborers, no more dependence on colonial soil. Mankind, it seemed, had finally conquered the fever and the earth in one stroke. Factories rose where forests had once stood. The air smelled of alcohol and smoke instead of sap. In Geneva and New York, pharmaceutical giants announced their new line of drugs: chloroquine, mepacrin, primaquine, each more efficient, more potent, more profitable. Governments stockpiled tablets by the millions. Soldiers of a new world war swallowed them before setting foot in Asia or Africa, and when they survived, it was chemistry they thanked, not the tree. Yet something in the victory felt hollow. The chemists had removed the bitterness, refined it into precision, but the triumph carried no scent, no shadow, no soul. The forests that had given birth to the cure were dead, the people who had tended them forgotten. What remained was a sterile kind of salvation, a cure without memory. In Java, the plantations rotted, the trees grew wild again, their bark thin, their branches twisted. Villagers avoided them, calling them the white ghosts, for at night their trunks glowed faintly under the moonlight, pale reminders of what had been taken. The Dutch were gone, but their order remained in ruins. Railway lines rusted in the grass, warehouses filled with mold, ledgers left behind like epitaphs. In the West, medicine became commerce. Pills were pressed, branded, and sold in boxes that promised global immunity. Quinine, chloroquine, mefloquine, they blurred into a single word: progress. Doctors prescribed them without thought of their lineage. No one spoke of bark anymore. No one needed to. The drug was now invisible, embedded in the bloodstream of civilization. But history, like the fever, is never truly cured. By the late 20th century, the malaria parasite began to adapt, learning the language of chemistry as swiftly as man had learned the secrets of trees. Resistance spread across the same lands once stripped for bark, a quiet rebellion written in blood cells. The laboratories raced to stay ahead, synthesizing stronger, faster, newer. The cycle began again: invention, exhaustion, replacement. The synthetic age had freed humanity from nature's dependence only to bind it to itself. The fever still waited, older than empire, older than science, patient as ever. And though the world no longer tasted quinine on its tongue, the bitterness remained diffused through wires and vials, humming quietly beneath the polished skin of progress. By the late 20th century, few people remembered that quinine had once come from a living forest. The world's cure was now manufactured by machines, but deep in the misted hills of West Java, one plantation remained the final living memory of empire's medicine. The locals called it Kebun Lama, the old garden. It was a place the government forgot, where the trees still rose in rows older than any man alive. Their trunks were pale and scarred, their bark flaking like parchment, their roots clutching at soil that had long ago grown bitter. No one came there for profit anymore. The global market had turned to synthetics decades earlier, and quinine had become a relic too expensive, too slow. But for the people of the nearby village, the old trees were something sacred, something not to be cut, not to be sold. They said the bark still remembered the hands that took too much. When the wind moved through the leaves, it carried whispers in two tongues, Javanese and Dutch. Like ghosts sharing secrets neither would confess in life. Each morning, an old caretaker named Pak Suro walked among the trees. His father had worked the plantation before the war, his grandfather before that. He still carried a small blade on his belt, though he hadn't harvested bark in years. He said the trees no longer wanted to give. He visited each one, touching the trunks as if counting the years through his fingertips. Some he spoke to. "You remember," he'd say softly. "You remember what they did." The ground was littered with the bones of industry-rusted tools, the remains of an old railway that once carried bark down to the port, the skeletal frame of a drying house whose roof had collapsed into weeds. The air still held a faint, sharp sweetness, the ghost of quinine. At sunset, the light turned silver, and the trees glowed faintly, as though their bark had learned to hold the memory of moonlight. Scientists came once, in 1978, a delegation from Jakarta and Geneva, men in pressed shirts and cameras. They took soil samples, bark scrapings, and photographs, promising to preserve the site for posterity. But when they left, they never returned. The world was done with trees. Its cures were bottled and barcoded. In the village, however, the fever still came every rainy season. When it did, the old women boiled water with a strip of bark, taken carefully from the fallen branches. The brew was dark, almost black, and its bitterness made the children cry. Yet within a day, the fever would break. No one called it quinine. They called it the old medicine, and they spoke of it with reverence, as if drinking the last memory of the earth itself. When Pak Suro died, his son buried him beneath the largest of the trees. The villagers say that on certain nights, when the fog lies thick and the wind moves just right, the bark seems to whisper again, not in pain, but in peace. The last plantation endures not as an in-pain industry, but as a prayer, a reminder that what is taken from the world never truly disappears, and that every cure is written in the language of its wounds. The fever tree's story ended not with an empire, but with an aftertaste faint, persistent, and impossible to forget. By the 21st century, the world no longer spoke the name cinchona. The bark that had once decided wars and shaped borders was now a ghost in chemistry textbooks, a Latin term tucked between equations and forgotten footnotes. Yet the bitterness remained not in medicine, but in memory, in the way nations still divided the world into those who live well and those who live in the shadow of fever. In the cities of the old empire, the gin and tonic survived as a symbol of leisure, the clink of ice in a glass, a lime cut clean across its rind. It was no longer a matter of life or death. It was a flavor. The tonic that once burned soldiers' throats now filled crystal goblets in rooftop bars. No one thought of bark or blood. They thought only of refreshment, of heritage, of a nostalgia too polished to sting. Yet each sip was a quiet communion with history. The bitterness that touched the tongue was the same that once carried through the jungles, the same that built railways and graves. The palate had forgotten what the body remembered. Meanwhile, the disease endured, quietly mocking its conquerors. In the tropics, where the old plantations had long since turned to scrub, malaria adapted again, reshaping itself against every new medicine man could forge. The synthetic age had made itself godlike, confident, sterile, sure of control, but the parasite never bowed. It changed its rhythm, learned the cadence of laboratories, slipped between formulas, and kept dancing in human blood. The fever that empire once believed extinct still claimed 500,000 lives a year. The jungle, as always, had the last word. In the archives of Amsterdam, a curator dusted off a crate of notebooks from the 19th century. Inside were sketches of bark, pressed leaves, a letter written in trembling hand. The bitterness that heals may also devour. No one knew who had written it. Perhaps a missionary, perhaps a chemist, perhaps someone who had tasted too much. The curator placed the letter under glass, labeling it Unknown Origin, 1852. Visitors walked past without slowing. The museum smelled of varnish and silence, and yet, somewhere in the hills of Java, a single grove still stood. The trees grew crooked now, their bark pale as bone. Villagers passed them without speaking, though a few old women still gathered fallen twigs to hang above their doors. They said the trees listened, that they forgave, but never forgot. When rain fell on their leaves, the water ran bitter. It soaked into the ground, into the streams, into the veins of the earth itself. In the end, the story of quinine was not about conquest or cure. It was about cost, the price paid in forests and fever, in greed and endurance. The empire built on bitterness had long since crumbled, but its flavor remained in the world's mouth, subtle and inescapable. Every glass lifted to the light, every toast to progress, carried it still the taste of survival, of suffering, of history itself. The taste of the fever tree,